Welcome to the Existentialist Society in Melbourne, Australia. Existentialism is an umbrella term covering diverse and often conflicting schools of thought. Consequently, we are not agreed on who or what is an existentialist. We simply agree to disagree. I'm David Miller, Secretary of the Existentialist Society. Our speaker today is John Noack, and his topic is Either or Neither, Kierkegaard's Ethology and Nietzsche's Übermensch. John, over to you.
Thank you, David. You've mentioned that a few introductory comments would be in order. Is it coming through okay?
Yes, it'd be better if you weren't sharing screen at the moment, but too bad. Go ahead.
Right. Can it be expanded to full screen? That'll be all right anyway. Well, I'm John Noack. I grew up in a Lutheran manse, so I was more or less required to follow on and be a Lutheran pastor, but I gave that away and became a secondary teacher and was teaching at Trinity Grammar School in Kew for quite a while. But since the 1970s, I've been attending various lectures on atheism, agnostics, existentialism, and so forth. And I've also been a long-term member of the Jung Society, so I've had quite a wide range of interests. Now I want to present a talk. It's not so much a lecture, a talk. So I would like to give you a chance to jot down any of the paragraph numbers if you want to refer back to anything. And then we can always find the spot where you want to discuss. So they are all in sequence. And as David has said, the theme today is either or neither, choice making in Kierkegaard's spheres and in Nietzsche's will to power. During late November in 2024, the Festival of Para Academia was held at their headquarters at 391 Queen Street in Melbourne. The word para academia refers to any activity in our wider society which is beside or in parallel with and outside of the officially funded academic institutions. Therefore, various voluntary and unfunded groups in Melbourne, such as the Existentialist Society, who have been conducting their intellectual pursuits and activities outside of the funded academic educational institutions and facilities, were invited to present information and or talks about their para-academic programs and endeavours. David Miller, the Secretary of the Existentialist Society, arranged for a talk to be presented at this week-long festival, and I had the pleasure of presenting a talk at 3:30 p.m. on Thursday, the 21st of November, 2024, and leading an impressive post-talk discussion on the topic, can existentialism be atheistic and religious? This talk required the clarification of such concepts and questions as what is atheistic existentialism, what is religious existentialism, what is spiritual and spiritual but not religious existentialism. It also required the analysis and evaluation of the current philosophical, religious and spiritual contexts for existentialism in order to establish whether existentialism could be both atheistic and religious. And so that was a very interesting exercise. Now, my philosophical background, although I spent my early years in a church manse, as I've said, being indoctrinated with biblical Christian fundamentalism, including six-day creationism, global flood geology, the eternal fires of hell, and many other unbelievable miracles and myths, I recall rejecting this theistic and theological supernaturalism during my teen years. In its place, I preferred to adopt the naturalistic and more rational approach to reality. During the 1960s, at the height of A.J. Ayer's logical positivism, which often resulted in the view of physicalism, I studied philosophy at the University of Adelaide. Then, during the 1970s, when I was enrolled in Middle Eastern Studies at Melbourne University, I was able to listen to the various lectures on existentialism, which were presented by Dr. Max Charlesworth in his various courses, including modern European philosophy. I have also heard many lectures on this philosophy at the meetings and lectures of the Melbourne Existentialist Society, which have since the 1970s been held at various venues. These public talks have stressed that existentialism is a rather practical and down-to-earth philosophy. It is a word which includes the concepts of existence and the verb to exist. Therefore, it seeks to give its priority to existence over the issue of essence or being. Now, Søren Kierkegaard. During the 1960s, I was enrolled at Luther Seminary in Adelaide, so I have also been interested in how Søren Kierkegaard, a Danish fellow Lutheran, applied existentialism to his own Lutheranism. Kierkegaard stressed both the need for interhuman relational interactions and relationality, and also his well-known leap of faith in relation to our human need to be bold and courageous when we need to make our various life choices. He was also in agreement with the view that existence and existing need to have precedence or priority over any conceived abstract, dogmatic and dogmatized essence. So I think you can see here that the leap of faith doesn't involve a leap of having to believe something, but it's a leap of confidence that when you make your choices, you'll be able to do so. You have the courage to do so. So people have often misunderstood that, and it has had some bad consequences as a result. Now, existentialism has traditionally placed much stress on the individual and on the individual's need to make and to accept responsibility for their own conscious choices. Since these choices tend to relate to the realistic and experienced human condition, at least 6 basic themes usually arise within any discourse relating to the philosophy of existentialism. These deal with the human condition in current terms and in a mostly human, secular, and increasingly atheistic context. These existential themes all happen to conveniently begin with the letter A. And they include the following, and these have come up at various talks. 1 is the actuality of our existing selves and persons. 2, our anxieties or experiences amongst. 3, the perceived absurdity of our existence as it is experienced and as we try to interpret it. 4, our awareness of a vast and deep abyss and or nothingness. 5, the threat of personal death and total annihilation in a future Hiroshima. And 6, our alienation from aspects of ourselves and of our increasingly materialistic Western society. These are 6 very common themes that are dealt with in existentialism. In the context of the above themes, our specific topic for discussion today is the following: either or neither, choice making in Kierkegaard's spheres and Nietzsche's will to power. Now, as mentioned above, an important practice at the basis of existential philosophy is the focus on individual choice making and the affirming of the many minor and the larger life-changing decisions and choices which all of us are required to make. Kierkegaard and Nietzsche are 2 such philosophers who are disturbed with the amount of choices that are made for people, rather than choices which individuals make for themselves. In order to move past a subject being tacted on as an object, that is, a person used by another person or by a cultural custom or law in choosing, both of these philosophers offer conceptions of individual choice that seem to move past this issue of the person being the object or victim and not the subject with the agency to choose. Both stress the need for humans to take the initiative and to adopt their own agency for their choices. This obviously places the personal exercise of free will above any external, impersonal, or imposed determinism. And that, of course, recalls all the debates that have gone on in the last couple of thousand years on the issue of free will and determinism. However, the question arises, in what way can we understand a self-making, conscious, truly independent, self-willed action? How do we understand the choices being made that still align with cultural values, with emotional responses, with rational thinking, and as truly willed personal choices? Though Kierkegaard, 1813 to 1855, aged only 42 when he died, and Nietzsche, 1944 to 1990, who was aged 56 when he died, both delineate views to understand choice as truly free and willed. Their conceptions have some flaws that may undermine the ability to understand the status of choice as being either imposed or being freely willed in their respective philosophies. So when we examine their work and their views, we can then move to try to understand issues of willing in their respective works. We can cross-examine their positions, discover the issues inherent in their understanding of willing, and proceed to offer a position that may allow for authentic self-willing. Now, Søren R.B. Kierkegaard was born in 1830 in Denmark, as we said, and died in 1855, 1842. His major works were either Or, which of course is relevant to this talk, in 1843, The Concept of Dread, 1844, Concluding Unscientific Proscript, 1846, and of course his journal. Now, Kierkegaard's ethological aesthetic sphere, or spheres. In this first sphere of existence, the great quest is to alleviate boredom by any means possible. This may be achieved by a constant changing of self, of others, and of environment. However, this method of ridding oneself of boredom is guided implicitly by this overwhelming desire. Though the choice appears to be open to many options, each one is guided by this goal of not being bored. In Kierkegaard's section on the rotation of crops, he describes the methods of which people may change their self, their surroundings, but will never achieve a calmness nor contentment with their choices. They will constantly be driven forward by the new, by the exciting, and by the different. Now, comments on boredom. However, if the external in this situation is what gives or removes boredom, then the self is understood in relation to the external, and choices are implicitly made on behalf of the external situation. If the external is what guides decisions, then there is a gap of illusion between the self deciding and the external world deciding. He writes that in both bureaucracy and relationships, the self cannot will because it is tied to the constraints of the external. How are relationships to persons that constrain individual choices any different from situational relation that limits or imposes direction or decisions? There's always this conflict between the freedom and the determinism. This is to say, the relation of the self that seeks to evade boredom, the choices one makes are in relation strictly to this concept.
which is to say this relation informs and guides all choices that are made in order to flee from this situation. The redeeming factor of this sphere is the focus on infinite possibility. However, in this infinite possibility of situation is limited by the will to escape boredom, all choices being made in relation to this one concept. Now, you can see from this that these spheres are actually subjective issues. They're issues that can't be settled simply by going to some empirical end result or evidence. They are issues of human nature, and so he calls them aesthetic issues. Aesthetic is the appreciation of beauty and goodness and that sort of thing. And so he moves then on to the ethical duty, and again, this is the subjective moral field, and not dealing with hard science here. In Kierkegaard's second sphere, the problem is amplified even more. Instead of having a guiding principle, relief of boredom that is satisfied by external causes, moving countries or new partners, etc., now the individual is guided by a principle of duty that is satisfied. By fulfilling abstract concepts like ethics, in this context, all the choices are limited by this concept of duty. Does Kierkegaard judge in this sphere will to this duty, or are choices narrowed and imposed upon him by this duty? Now, clearly, freedom to choose can be understood both in the positive and the negative. Willing to a duty's call can be a choice to fulfill that duty, but it can also be an imposition of that duty that negates the option to choose what the duty forbids. How can one understand which of these situations is accurate in ethical decisions? So there's a lot of thinking that has to go on there. Then his third one is the infinite and the finite. In his book, Sickness Unto Death, specifically, Kierkegaard deals with the self as a product of relations. In this sense, a human results from a relation between the infinite, noumena, the spirit, the eternal, and the finite, phenomena, body, temporal. So he's dealing with what you call a physical universe and also a psychical universe. So he's not just a physicalist, he's also a psychicalist. So this does not create a true self, as a human can live without a self as he defines it. Instead, the self, or ability for the self to be created from a relation to the absolute or God, the self can only be realized through a relation to God, arises as a relation between the relation of the finite and infinite, relating back to the human. This would be a positive relation. And so that's how he deals with his three spheres. So you can see that they're difficult issues because of the paradoxes and the different alternative paths within each of those. Now, what does Friedrich Nietzsche do with it? Well, he was the son of a Lutheran pastor. He was born in 1844, as we said, in Saxony, died 1900, age 56. His major works were, of course, The Gay Science, 1882, and Thus Spake Zarathustra, 1883, which is relevant to this talk. Beyond Good and Evil also is relevant, and The Antichrist and The Twilight of the Gods, or sometimes it's called The Twilight of the Idols. Nietzsche departs from the relational model that Kierkegaard offers by focusing exclusively on the strength of the self alone, isolated and immovable by externalities. The end goal of his writing is the rise of the Übermenschen, or the superior superhumans. Those who are able to operate and to elevate their attitudes and actions beyond the common categories of good and evil, or right and wrong, and to create new integrated values. This sounds a bit Jungian, in fact, with this ultimate quest for wholeness and integration. These individuals are distinguished from the herd of society by actively creating instead of passively receiving their values, their oral guiding compass for decision making. This compares the herd mentality with the creative hero. The process here is for individuals to make values and not simply accept them or allow them to be indoctrinated by traditional values. When many would be swayed and influenced, the one who transvalues should say, or what I will or desire or choose or determine instead. He calls for moving beyond the commonly held and often traditional handed down values or herd mentality by transvaluing these views and teachings. Now, this philosophy is born from two realizations. One, that the metaphysics that have been used to justify actions and decisions in Western society are at their base flawed, specifically theologically grounded metaphysics of Christianity. And secondly, that secular ideologies of the state and ethics are equally baseless in grounding claims of direction or ideals or destiny or destination. And they are, in a way, also subjective issues. The feature of Nietzsche's conception of a transvaluation of values that is original and offers the possibility of authentic willing or willfully and intentionally determining is the manner in which new values are chosen. These values, and thus directions and actions, are created causa sui, or self-causing, originating with the individual and not based on in relation to externals. By not basing decisions in relation to an external, self-generating value can be established not for the state, not for the deity, not for others, but simply for oneself. They are not received from a divine book, as Christians, of course, do with the Bible and the Muslims with their Quran. They are not received from the state, and they are not accepted passively from others. That is not to say that decisions cannot be made that appear to be like the herd, but rather like Kierkegaard's night of faith. That's the faith, that's the trust, the confidence that you can make choices. The intention and manner in which the individual chooses is the significance, not the content of the choice. So there's that significance, it's the power behind it, the confidence or trust. Now, Nietzsche sort of felt that this needed an allegory. And so he's come up with a very interesting one. For Nietzsche, this distinction that he's been discussing is made in two ways. First is his allegory of the camel, the lion, and the child. In this passage, one, the camel is the basic understanding of the herd and the herd mentality in society. Individuals who merely carry ideals that others have put into them, trudging forward in a guided manner, not a chosen manner. So that's the camel. Number two, the lion is the rebellion against this herd mentality. And as you know, he's happy to find his food in the herd. He's trying to get control of the individual cattle in the herd or the animals in the herd. So the lion is the rebellion, asserting through will his values in opposition to the herd. However, the lion still understands his choices in relation to others. The lion still makes decisions in reference to the external, including hunger, of course. and understands his options and choices relative to the external, making them not truly free-willed actions. The final passage of the section revolves around the child, one who creates from within, not in opposition or mimicry, that's imitation, of the external. This is the role of the Übermensch, one who does not base their actions in relation to the external, but rather creates anew. So he puts a lot of stress on that naivety of the child, who is happy to accept his inner life and is creating new in imagination and so forth. So freely willed choices. In this manner, Nietzsche offers a unique way for individuals to reimagine their lives by stating that freely willed choices make anew compasses for the person, not for all persons. Metaphysical claims of theological guidance by divine laws are external impositions that individuals may believe, but this absolves them of their creative potential and possibilities. Obviously, people who are in the ex-religious group and have been imposed on by these dogmas and doctrines and customs are well aware of this issue of being deprived of your own personal creative potential. Now that's being discussed at quite some depth here in Melbourne recently. A bit more on the herd mentality. Likewise, persons who gaze toward the herd mentality of society and receive social mores as their guiding principles absolve themselves of creation, and furthermore absolve themselves of responsibility for their choices and actions. This absolvement or absolving of self-creation and responsibility for choices makes one an object, not a subject, in relation to the external. The external pushes upon the objectified self and moves them. They are no longer a willing person, no longer a primum movens or prime mover or external initiator. They become actors in the scripts of society. And many, Nietzsche believes, play their roles quite too well. Instead of fitting into roles that previously exist, one needs to write their own life script with their own created roles and values. Now, eternal recurrence. Verification of the self-creation of values can be understood with the eternal recurrence, an idea Nietzsche mentions, if not always explicitly by name, by content in several texts. The choices that one makes, should they be revisited over and over again for all eternity, either affirm or negate authentic willing. And that's important for both Kierkegaard and Kierkegaard, is to come up with this authentic willing, authentic personal willing, not to be a part of the herd. If an action is to be willed eternally, then it seems to be an authentically willed choice, one that the person viewed as their good. However, if it is a decision regretted, one that was not self-willed, but rather imposed on the person, then by all means one should reject living that choice over and over for all eternity. This verification, perhaps, is a means for the self to affirm their choices. However, it may not be enough to affirm the authenticity of the non-relationally chosen actions. By this action, though one may affirm a choice, regardless of the consequences, that does not in itself verify that the action was done without being based on externals. Is there a way in which this could be ascertained, that the self-willing is original and not based on an external? Well, what's the right path? If you can say is their right path in existentialism. The person that genuinely wills without basing the choice on externals creates values anew. They liberate themselves from the relationality of choice that shapes most persons. Their creation is theirs and theirs alone. It does not serve as a path for others, but rather it is willed for the self-fulfillment of the creator. However, how should this creator choose their path? Here lies the flaw with Nietzsche's self-creation. There is no vacuum between self and others. All is relational. All relates to each other, interactional, all those sort of words. The original creation of values that these Übermenschen would make would have to, at their base, be in contrast to, or at least in relation to others. The compass, the sailing, these paths would be chosen from what base? A rational examination, what the Übermensch wants. What would reason base its desire on, if not an emotional or relational aspiration? It is all well and good to claim that one creates their own path and that it is not intended to be anyone else's path but the creator's. But how does the creator decide in the first place which path to make or to choose? Basic values. What values lie at the base of their decisions of what and how to create? They, at the least, must be based on the language of the other in the linguistic framework of the relations. 1, there is first the constraint of the creator to create within the linguistically enframed world. So he's confined with the language he can use. Secondly, these paths must be chosen with a desire at the root, either an emotionally or rationally valued desire. And there are the two aspects. There's the emotional and rationality. We know that Jung had these same divisions. He saw sensation and thinking as part of the rational side, and feeling and intuition he had as the emotional. So you need both of these to be taken into consideration, always, in everything. This seems to be ultimately at the very base, a preference for left over right, a preference for blue over green, a preference for solitude over community. So there's an intermingling, in other words. These preferences reflect an embodied mind, one that is ultimately always in relation to the world, not above or below, but simply in relation to. This relationality ultimately may not lead to the final decision in the process, may not produce the compass point in Nietzsche's ship, but rather underlies the entire process as the frame and needle of the compass. It does not point north on its own, but rather gives the possibility to point north. Transvalues, the basic relationality of self and society, of self and values, is the foundation for which the Übermensch creates new values, or more appropriately, trans values, above the current values to find something that is integrating or deeper, whatever. One crosses over the values one is in relation to. One deconstructs one value to formulate another. One destroys in order to create. These values are implicit in Nietzsche's Übermenschen. They cannot start from nothing to create anew. They are already in relation to values, pre-existing values, in order to create new ones. While this may not determine the final value set, it does guide the creation of these values, thus making the self-creation of values at its first instant relational to the external. So if you compare Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, there's the leap of faith or leap of trust or confidence or boldness you know, this faith needs to be expanded always with Kierkegaard, and the Übermensch, or the power to transvalue. Okay, so if Kierkegaard's leap of faith places choices in relation to the infinite, and Nietzsche's Übermensch places choices in relation to the origin of transvaluation, must it follow that the choices made are not authentic because they are in relation to an external? In other words, does relation to the external as a basis for choice limit the possibility of choice in such a way that the choices are not authentically being willed, authentically being willed? By being authentically willed means a choice that is not determined by an external, a will that is not in its finality shaped by motives outside of the one who wills. Though the basis for decision must be framed within a common language, within an embodied self, and in relation to social values that one is thrown into the world in, this may not necessitate that the final choice of an individual is not willed. If it did necessitate this, then authentic free choice would be at its base impossible. We could never achieve authentic willing. So there's some flaws. Rather, one should conceive of both Kierkegaard's and Nietzsche's conceptions of free, authentic will as flawed in two ways. For Kierkegaard, too much emphasis is placed on the external reality in relation to the self. And for Nietzsche, too much emphasis is placed on the internal self by omitting entirely the external. Both extremes, by their internal logic, are viable, but rather a syncretistic or a blending small mixture of these views can achieve a position that is internally consistent and offers a way of thinking, of willing, that is authentic and free. An Übermensch that has no relation to the external has no means to understand the world, let alone choose paths within the world. They inherit language, culture, social relations, and of course, a Weltanschauung, or worldview, from the world. And they use these values to shape their view of the world. Whether or not a person passively receives and projects, as the herd would do, or actively transvalues and creates, as Übermensch does, the individual relies as a foundation on the external. Now, Kierkegaard's spheres of human experience. The situation is even more pronounced in Kierkegaard's three subjective, feeling-based, moral and intuitive human spheres. The ethologically aesthetic, and etho relates to customs, subjective customs and rituals and things like that. So the ethologically aesthetic, who appreciates and evaluates what is beautiful and what is ugly, but who is bound by external pleasure in a constant drive to escape boredom. 2, the morally ethical, who is in search of rules for living, which decrees in detail what is good and right and what is bad and wrong, and who is bound by morality in a constant drive to fulfill their duty. And 3, the religious or religionist, who is bound by their mostly ancient and superseded faith, or beliefs, you could say there, to fulfill their relation to the infinite and to their personal selected personal god or goddess, whom they subjectively define as their highest value or ultimate concern or ultimate reality or ground of being, which produces the abbreviated name Gob. These are therefore bound to the external in ways that are not deemed issues for choosing authentically. They both fall short here. Nietzsche overlooks the inherent ties to others in his circle of himself, Kierkegaard denies the self a creative choice through external courage and confidence. So a synthesis then that results is an approach melding their views may offer means to arrive at authentic will, one that is not exclusively framed by the external nor denies the self-creation of values, starting with the realization that the self is inframed by the world, so we're part of the world, whether we like it or not, that the basic parameters of navigating are set and determined by physical reality. We already have some limitations that the will must traverse. The neither. However, the external nature of these set parameters must not, as Nietzsche fears, guide and determine the willed actions of an individual. Rather, they set the basic conditions in which an individual can navigate. The individual is not isolated in their creation of values and willing, as Kierkegaard seems to deny, but they are not exclusively relational either. It is not the either of Kierkegaard nor the or of Nietzsche that should be used to understand free authentic willing, but rather the neither of both thoughts. Blending together with an integrated approach of these philosophies will allow us to be critical of external values and to be able to transvalue, but also to be cognizant of the relation that all individuals have with the external. This balance of Nietzsche's and Kierkegaard's different approaches to choosing means that the individual willing actions can be influenced by external without being controlled by the external. Every choice made has an external input, however weak or dissociated to the eventual choice. These decisions are shaped by the external, but not determined by the external. The concluding comments then are each individual has the conscious ability to reflect, analyze, and experience in the way that they freely choose to do so. The integration of the relationality or interaction or interplay with the external taken internally creates a situation understanding in which the person freely wills choices, authentic choices, without being molded into a determined figure by the external situation. So that brings to an end the talk, which was exploring and coming to terms with the philosophies of both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. So thank you for your attendance here today and listening, and I'll look forward to your comments. If you have noted down, well, then I can refer back to the particular paragraph or section because they're all numbered sequentially.
Well, thank you, John. Can you press stop share now?
No, I haven't got that here.
It should be next to the green button at the bottom of the screen.
Yeah, I haven't got any of those. I need full screen, and I've I don't know. I can't get full screen anymore. Oh, here we are now. I've got something, share. So what do I press?
Stop share. Should be red. It should say stop share.
It doesn't say that. It pops under more. No, show meeting, annotate, pause, share, chat, participants, video, audio. That's all I've got. Oh, stop share. There it is. It says it in words. I found it. So I'll press that now.
Yes.
There we are. Now, can I get back to if I need to refer to the text?
Presumably, yes, John. Now,
anyway, if not, it doesn't matter.
Now, before we throw the meeting open to questions, comments, and discussion with John Noack, I have a couple of announcements. The first of which is that the next Existentialist Society lecture will take place on Saturday the 3rd of May in 1 month's time. And Remco van Santen will be speaking on the missing first person, rethinking science from within. I'll repeat that. The missing first person, rethinking science from within. So that's 1 month's time, Existentialist Society lecture. The Existentialist Society has weekly Zoom events at this time each week, and where they have different groups presenting the events. Now, to see those topics, weekly topics, and to get the links, you'll have to get onto the Existentialist Society's meetup page, which I will put in the chat for you, and there it is. Now for our questions, comments and discussion section, we'll use the raised hand method so we can get you to speak in turn. And you'll find, for those who don't know, the raised hand icon is in the React tab at the bottom of the screen. So, Les, go ahead.
Oh, thanks, David. And thanks, John, for a really thought-provoking talk. And I'm glad I got in early because I wanted to get in before the long queue of questioners started popping up, and I can see they are popping up. I'm not an expert, nowhere near an expert on either on Kierkegaard or Nietzsche, but I really liked the way you synthesize the two views and come to a median point, accepting there are external realities, but like the existentialists emphasize, we have this ability to choose beyond our situation. So first on externalities. So going with Nietzsche, you object to his view that you can avoid or go above your externalities altogether. So you make room for externalities. But I mean, I'm thinking that there's also internalities that we also can't easily escape from, and we have no reason to escape from. And I'm thinking about our basic human nature. And here I go to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. All of us who have gone through a natural developmental process have these basic needs for food, shelter to begin with, sex, friends, and then the top one, self-actualization, which goes to what the existentialists do a lot of talking about, our need to self-actualize. So we have these basic drives, and that kind of a bit goes against the existentialist view of saying we don't have an essence. Well, in some ways we do have an essence. It's our biological and psychological makeup that's given to us. So that's the first thing. Maybe it's not just that we can't escape externalities altogether, but there's also some internalities we can't escape, and we have no good reason to escape, because otherwise you wouldn't be a human being if you tried to escape them. You'd be a nothing. The second point is that on Nietzsche's valuing of our ability to freely choose, so go outside of externalities. And this is where I really like your talking about the relational aspect of the values we choose. So I agree with Nietzsche that our ability to choose beyond our externalities is something that is good, and we need to actually enact. But therein lies the relational aspect. If being able to act autonomously is a good for me, then it's a good for everyone. And the way Nietzsche writes, that he's saying it's not just a good for him, it's a good for everyone. If it's a good for everyone, then there's a constraint. I need to choose and act in a way that enables my autonomy without impeding the autonomy of other people. there's that relational aspect you spoke so clearly about, John. So, so as much as Nietzsche wanted to go above the social conditioning and our relations with others, his own philosophy of autonomy provides some constraints that I think it seems like he didn't recognize himself. So thanks, John. There's certainly a lot in your talk that is very much food for thought. Thanks.
Yeah, I think a couple of comments there. We can imagine that philosophers like to have their system all sewn up. That was, of course, the big issue between Freud and Jung. Freud wanted everything to be sewn up, everything, all the loose ends tied together, and no room for any doubt at the end of it. And of course, Jung had the opposite idea that life was continually exploring, and he's forever getting new data to see what it said, and he was quite prepared to change his whole view about things. So there's this flexibility, and both of them, you see, Kierkegaard obviously got caught up in the more religious aspect of feeling this duty towards others, the relationality. He felt that he needed to make his philosophy that, and of course he ignored the other subjective free willing sort of things that he probably felt awkward to deal with in his church context. Whereas you have Übermensch, you have Nietzsche, who apparently by 1990 has sort of become insane, or has at least had to be put into a mental hospital. But up till then, his stuff was very interesting. But he more and more was putting stress entirely on the inner realm and the power to transvalue and to be creative and to adopt that psychology of the baby, freshly born. The whole world's ahead. The archetype of the baby is always great potential. At Christmas with obviously with the baby, Jesus Christmas, same thing. People actually think, oh yeah, what he was turned into later, the great Messiah, the King of the universe, all this sort of stuff. But they already see that in that, in the Christ child. So the image of the child is actually has a tremendous amount of potential, and so Nietzsche developed that as the potential, the creativity that was possible for the person to do. So, but he went entirely on that side of it, and so at the end I felt, well, both of them were at fault. That there were flaws in it, because one was trying to, Kierkegaard was trying to put all the stress on relationality and duty and all that sort of thing, all of it, and it was in the end not much room for authentic willing. Whereas on the other hand, Nietzsche was all authentic willing, or claiming to be authentic willing, but yet forgetting that he was living in the world. And he was bound by the worldview that we were holding and the language and things like that. And so the obvious conclusion is that they needed to be integrated and brought together, as you've noted. And so a thing like this, it took a while to get it all sort of articulated, but you can boil it down very, in just a few terms, as you have. That there was two extreme views, externality and internality, but then they somehow needed to be together to support each other and develop an authentic willing. And also we're caught up in the big debate for the last 2,000 years. What's been the big debate? Freedom versus determinism. And then you've got the Presbyterian Church is absolutely caught up in the determinism and the superiority and the omnipotence of deity is able to control all of our lives. They're caught up in that, and of course then you've got the debates with the free willers, and so this has been a big issue. So, but somehow or other we have to blend the two together and not just try to go down one path, but both. So thanks for picking that up, and you've sort of repeated the whole talk in a nutshell. Thank you.
Thank you, Les and John. Stephen, it's your turn.
Thank you very much, John. That was an excellent piece of work. I really look forward to when I get the chance of rereading what you wrote there. I was just wondering how long it took you to put that together, or the few subjects which you've been pondering for years there might be the question. I don't understand Kierkegaard that well. I got the impression that he was talking about, when he talked about the aesthetic individual, he was talking about the ordinary naive person who wishes to follow others. They don't want to create productive capabilities. They want to work for somebody else. They don't want to come up with ideas about the direction of society. They want to leave that to a Führer. The ordinary person just wants easy choices. They go home at night and watch their favourite TV drama. That's the aesthetic individual. They just live to be a child and have a good time. So, I mean, isn't that Kierkegaard's point that most people are true children? I was wondering what you had to say to that, John.
Well, he made quite a lot of boredom, which is very interesting. But but that drives you to then want to relate. But in his own life, apparently, he had his relationships were real failures. He didn't have very much success, but yet he still stressed the relational side of reality, and the boredom was simply a way of saying, well, boredom, if you look around in society, how is it broken? It's people going on trips around the world and visiting this and that and finding things to do to break the boredom. And so he put a lot of stress on that. But he was a fairly gloomy sort of fellow too, poor old Kierkegaard. Very, very pessimistic about everything. But you get a certain confidence about Nietzsche in contrast, that he said, well, I've got it all sewn up, it's all within me, and I can rule the world. A bit Trumpy, probably.
You don't feel Nietzsche was a bit of a showman?
Oh, he was that, certainly, but anybody who thinks that they've sewn up, that they have the ultimate philosophy that's going to answer everything.
I know Jung had a bit of a problem with that, didn't he?
Yeah. Well, he saw that as the part of the Thor, and the Norse problem of the.
You don't mean Nietzsche was possessed by Wotan?
Wotan, I think Jung associated him with Wotan. Yeah, that's right.
Oh, that explains a lot. Oh, thank you, John. Yeah, I would like to read it.
It's been recorded. If it's been recorded, well, certainly it'll be available. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much.
I know it's got a bit complicated, but in the end, I knew where I was going, so I wasn't worrying, even if you were.
Yes, the recording of today's session will be available on our YouTube channel probably within a couple of days.
Okay.
Derek, your turn. Unmute yourself, Derek.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, John. There's very, interesting pieces in there that I'd like to follow up on. So I mean, I'll take it that your, interpretation of Kierkegaard and Nietzsche is accurate. I had to follow up on that also. So we're talking about the relation of choices to external constraints. So I'm not too certain about what the relation of Kierkegaard and Nietzsche are to those external constraints, but I think that certainly the notion of creating values, I think it's misleading, because I don't think personally we do create values. I think what we should call them is we invent or construct our values out of the material that we have. Out of the material, out of the ideas, out of the externalities that exist, which brings us to but what is the motive underlying these things? I mean, a couple of people Sartre, he talks about a basic choice, a fundamental choice about things, you know, which is going to colour all the other choices amongst the different choices that we have. Again, Spinoza, he doesn't believe in free will, but he nevertheless believes in affirming or negating things, which is a kind of a choice. But then again, on one interpretation of existential choice, there is a choice where we don't know, we haven't got access to the information that we need to make the choice, but nevertheless we have to make the choice. It's a existential choice. We make the choice, and therefore we have to be responsible and stand behind the choice that we've already made. So there's a sense there of the motive, the responsibility for that choice. I mean, I'd like to talk a little bit about, you talked about earlier about the fundamental value that's underlying, that motivating that choice. I'd like to talk a little bit about that, but I just mentioned that I think there is something that one could say about that, and I'll leave it at that. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, John.
Well, you're certainly welcome to read the books. They're all very, very available. Obviously, when I did a theological course back in the 1960s, one of the issues was free will and determinism, and the arguments that the Lutheran Church was having with the Reformed tradition and that sort of thing. And I didn't really want to graduate. My father sort of said I had to be a pastor, so I went and did that, and so I've been involved with these issues for many, many years. And of course, then I joined the Jung Society in 1975, and I've been a member there for 40 odd years. So these are issues. Obviously, Nietzsche, who was trying to very much make a human being who was self-contained. He wanted to be the ultimate self-contained person who could feel himself superior to all other humans, because he could create the values that he felt were needed, and he could satisfy his own life that way, over against Kierkegaard, who obviously was getting caught up more in responsibility, duty, other issues that were dragging him the other way. So certainly it was a great contrast between the two, and that's what I found very, very fascinating. But then you've got the other issue that Nietzsche went insane during the 1890s, not 1890s, and then you sort of wonder, well, what does that do to all his earlier work? But I don't think it makes any difference, because he'd been working on this for a while. It was one of his earlier works, Thus Spake Zarathustra. So I think we can take it that was Nietzsche's serious work, but of course it was very much self-contained. He's got a very self-contained sort of outlook, whereas Kierkegaard was still caught up in the dogmas and whatnot of Christianity, and so he had a slightly different approach. So my paper was simply trying to say, well, perhaps we should somehow bring together the relationality between the internal and the external. That would be it in an absolute nutshell.
Did you want to respond, Derek?
Yeah, okay, I'll just briefly say, well, of course, Nietzsche didn't believe in free will, which is quite a surprising feature, I think. But I think it indicates, I mean, I'd like to hear what you say, that he thought that the notion that we don't have free will indicates that we are strongly constrained by the externals. So, this is a very strong view here.
Well, no doubt while they were thinking of trying to get to their more monistic type of approach, maybe these other issues were bugging them, but they just ignored them. They tried to wish them away. But eventually, I think you have to bring them together. Like you have to bring the external, internal into a relationship somehow. That's what I've been trying to say, that we need to be a bit more open and flexible, and allow for both trends to be carefully looked at. I mean, none of us can say we've invented a language and that's it, and we're not going to worry about anybody else. You can't have a language without sharing it with others, and a worldview. They're in the world. They have to have some sort of Weltanschauung, and so that in relation to Nietzsche, see, was something that he may have wished away, but it was a factor.
Thank you, John. Nathaniel, your turn. Unmute yourself.
Thanks. So yeah, I think in regards to Nietzsche, it is kind of confusing when you read his stuff because he wants you to become like the best version of yourself, basically, you know, and he wants you, he doesn't say work hard at it, but it's in a sense like he wants you to work hard at it. But he also does explicitly reject free will in a lot of his works. So it's confusing because he thinks only a certain few people can kind of rise above like their culture and become like, you know, exemplary human beings. But I don't know how you do that though, because he like in Beyond Good and Evil, he calls the concept of free will crass and stupid. So I think I don't know what he would say about being authentic in that sense. I think I don't know. I think it's almost like this thing like where you either have it or you don't, kind of, and it doesn't involve any type of will. So to be like authentic like that, it just kind of like some people are just able to rise above the herd, basically, like Nietzsche himself, I think he would say. And it doesn't involve choice, but it's just kind of like having this ability to do it. So I think maybe, yeah, we should still recognize that Nietzsche didn't like the notion of free will. He thought he says different things in different places against it, but yeah. Anyways, thank you.
Yeah, it could well be that that's just something that he wished away, and it didn't exist for him. But of course, you and anybody else reading his work will pick up something like that. So, you know, writers can be very great deluders of themselves too. If they've got a theme or a thesis or something, and they're going to prove it right or wrong, you know, a lot of stuff has been written that hasn't been well written, not balanced, and you know, the end result is you haven't got something that is really of great value. But anyway, look, your point is certainly well made. It's he probably found that a problem himself. We find a problem, he probably did too.
Thank you, John. Stephen.
Yeah, probably want to argue the point of Nietzsche's Superman. To my understanding, he qualified that, didn't he? He said he wasn't talking really about anything in the present breed of humanity. Now, this is something I think I might be right about. Nietzsche didn't disregard science. He hated it that we lived under the constraints of scientific opinion, but nevertheless, he felt impelled to believe what science seemed to be demonstrating. Certain areas was evolution. He might have personally disliked the idea that we're descended from apes, but he felt this is the obvious science. It has to be true, and we're going to have to deal with it. Another element was the Kant Laplace system of cosmology, which came from Sir Isaac's background was Sir Isaac Newton's physics, and they came to call it Laplace's demon. It basically were in a big mechanical system which was completely predictable. And to Nietzsche, even though he disliked the idea, he felt this discounted the idea of free will. If we're living in a universe which at the time, the science of his time, demonstrated without doubt was just a vast machine, that's what we're living in. That's Laplace's demon. That is the eternal return. This is people discount how much Nietzsche was referring to out in the world science, which had appeared in such a spectacular and powerful way. But getting back to the Superman, he was claiming that the Superman would be a future evolutionary form of humanity. We haven't evolved yet. There are no supermen. There might be people that show the seeds of the Superman, you know, there might be a Napoleon, a Machiavelli, and a Nietzsche, who show just a little bit of the shining light of the Superman to come, but they are not Superman. They are the same cursed breed that are modern men. They will die out. Nature will get rid of us and replace us with the greater type of man. We are all evolutionary creatures going out to the void. We're finished. Nature has had enough of us. What do you think of that, John? Thank you.
I've always been worried about that Uber, because Uber is not really super. It's not Superman. Uber is over or above, or supra would be a better way of putting it. You know, the supra-human rather than superhuman. The superhuman is so immediately gets the picture, oh, we're dealing with a realm or beings that can do everything humans can't do. That's superhuman. Miraculous, you know, all the miracles under the sun, and it's what angels do, it's what God does, it's what all this happens. So I think super certainly is a bad use of word, but I would say over human, above the present state of humanity. And he's just thinking that if he can encourage this baby stage of inner creativity, of no great worries about relationality, you know, just a baby born with a brain, and then that brain ticking over, and you know, you can say what you like about babies, but he would use it as a symbol of self-contained creativity, and it's potential there to be anything. And as we said before, with Christ, he had a baby Jesus at Christmas time, and it doesn't say many years, and he's been turned into the Lord of the universe.
Well, could you qualify that, John? Do you or I or anything which is a man have the ability to be anything?
No, you couldn't get up and fly up to this.
Yeah, I've tried.
Yeah,
Didn't work.
I'm sure you couldn't fly up to heaven. Anyway, that's certainly an important point there, that we don't mistranslate or translate wrongly concepts that these are working with, and we give them a wrong impression when we put it into English.
And my other point is he was very affected by the scientific thoughts of his day.
Yeah, now that is of interest, because you see that is another point that where the external is the Weltanschauung, the Weltanschauung, the worldview is impinging on him, but at the same time he's trying to be this self-contained baby, you know, with this potential for ultimate creativity, and there again, I mean, what you say, yeah, if it's correct, you obviously is, that he is in fact being impinged on the external, as he's trying to be self-contained on the internal. And that's why it was simply just in reverse. Kierkegaard was the opposite, very much involved in external, with duty, with, you know, with how he's going to react to people. And, you know, we've got the church believing all sorts of things. To what extent are you going to go along with that? Whereas they were opposites to each other in their stress. But it's interesting that they were each trying to set up a monistic sort of system that would explain everything. But what I'm saying is that, in fact, they both need to be deconstructed so that we can look rather for a balance, and how both can deal more honestly and authentically with reality. I guess that's what's needed. You know, that we're honest about it. We're not going back to their idea of trying to produce artificially some great monistic system. But what does reality actually tell us? Anyway, that's just my thinking.
Thank you, John. James, your turn. James, unmute yourself. Good.
Yeah, fine. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, John. Really good, interesting paper you read for us. And can we if we want to understand what Nietzsche means by the child, and the child is somehow a free will, not a free will by choice, but a free will to power. Can we compare his child, to Freud's, interpretation of perhaps what Nietzsche meant with his notion of the child? He called the polymorphous perverse, and the polymorphous perverse is the image of the human being at the first stage of life, when it's not yet acculturated and not yet castrated, not yet oppressed by social convention and culture and society. And Nietzsche was really, talking about that kind of free will of the child, who is not willing by choice, but by the experience of this sense of polymorphous perverse, the experience of feeling, experiencing the world, experiencing life, at its rawness, and before it's been before castration, and before repression and sublimation. So what Nietzsche meant by free will, or willing, is the will to power. Going back, because he criticizes the whole, Western tradition of rationalism, and that kind of, a kind of repression that occurs, and he's coming after Hegel, and so he's also responding to Hegel's rational system of philosophy, and criticizing that Hegel is building a castle, but living in a hut, next to the castle. And so Nietzsche is talking about how to live life to the fullest, and making that kind of free choice in terms of the freedom to the will to overcome the all the repression and all the obstacles that stand in its way of being authentic to itself.
Yeah, you raised important issues here. One is that the symbol of the child is very much expresses the concept of potential. There's all sorts of potential in the child that's born. Now, we know that Christianity sort of spoilt that, in the sense that they decreed that with the fall, Adam and Eve ate the apple, or whatever they did, and then from then on, all babies are conceived in sin. And the Psalms, the Old Testament says they're born and conceived in sin. They're never given a chance for potential. Never. Not if you're conceived in sin. Then you're determined that you're a corrupt old sort of person. Nietzsche would have rejected that, and he saw the child rather as a tabula rasa, from a positive perspective, that there's great potential in that, and one is that a child is able to create. He's not held back by original sin or things like, or negatives. So there's great potential there. And I think what Freud is saying is much the same thing. If in fact a polymorphous perversion is sort of thought of more as the polymorphous rawness, as you said. Rawness is a better word. I don't like the perverse idea. That's getting it back to this original sin, I think. But there's a rawness. It's a primitivity there in the baby that's got that potential. And that was the aspect that, of course, that Nietzsche was interested in, this potential. And for him, for Nietzsche himself, he was claiming to be, to have that potential to be the supra-human, just beyond, just a bit above all the other humans. Not a superhuman. No, we'll get rid of that idea. It wasn't superhuman. To be a supra-human, someone slightly over or above the herd, but not in some heaven or, you know, some out in some fantasy world out in space somewhere. So I think your point is extremely good there, and it helps to understand how Nietzsche, in fact, could see so much in the baby symbol. He certainly did. He had the lion, he had the camels all lined up, and how they were described, and it's rather strange to suddenly find him referring to the child or the baby. But it certainly makes sense. And it makes sense to you, obviously.
Hello.
George, go ahead. Jay Davis has gone off somewhere.
Thank you very much. I always find it fascinating, or I find it fascinating, that people like to put forward very soft reads of Nietzsche, which I think really, undermine his argument and really peripheralize him, even as they're trying to save him, because Nietzsche's argument is a very, very straightforward one. Also, it's a very mendacious, sinister argument, because he is, and I'm glad someone mentioned Hegel, because of course Nietzsche is rejecting universal justice, the idea of universal values, and instead he's saying, look, the Superman or the Hobbesian Leviathan, right, jettisoning the liberal components of Hobbes, is what establishes order. These are the dynamic individuals of society, the Ubermen, or the Superman is translated into English. And really it's interesting because Nietzsche, and this is, again, Nietzschean scholars that I think are honest about him, Nietzsche would have disagreed with the Nazis because the Nazis argued that the people of the Aryan race have certain rights. Nietzsche would disagree with that. Nietzsche would disagree with the idea that anyone should have rights. The supermen of society, they determine the contours and content of the society. They determine what rights, they determine whatever privileges you have and what you don't have, right, based on individual basis. So Nietzsche is clearly an overt rejectionist of the Enlightenment. He specifically rejects Hegel, and of course, absolutely detests Marx, to the extent that he would have known about Marx. And so, Nietzsche's a very, very vile, I would not call him a philosopher, because it doesn't rise to the level of philosophy. There's a reason why the Nazis look positively upon Nietzsche. There's a whole anti-Enlightenment, canon, and really, in fact of matter, I would say definitively, it begins with Nietzsche. I mean, there are other people that people like to point to, precursors to Nietzsche, but it begins with Nietzsche. It follows Schmitt, Strauss, Heidegger, and to be perfectly honest, it goes to Foucault. Again, these are attacks on reason. Again, certainly a rejection of all men are created equal, unambiguously a rejection of all men are created equal. So, I mean, Trump and his government and Bannon, these individuals, certainly Bannon, is an overt admirer of Nietzsche. And so Nietzsche is the figure of the far right for a very good reason. And I find it a little baffling that people try to have these very sideway or very mush readings of Nietzsche. Maybe it's an effort to save him. Maybe they see something else in there that has some value. But Nietzsche is a very, very retrograde figure. And again, I would not call him a philosopher in any way, shape, or form. It's just a set of misanthropic kind of biases that again justify dictatorship, the rejection of any semblance of democracy. Thank you.
John?
Oh, well, of course. I mean, when you're dealing with bringing up the Nazis, that's a big issue because, you know, the Superman would have been looked at in the context of Hitler, but the Nazis then went on to their atrocious activities, and Nietzsche wouldn't have, you know, just wouldn't have been able to say he contributed anything to that. I mean, you can have a dictator, but in the history of people have been quite enjoyed having benevolent, what they called benevolent dictators. And in fact, Putin claims to be a benevolent dictator in Russia. He's a dictator, but he thinks he's doing just the right thing for everybody and being nice to everybody. So there's different levels of dictatorship. We think of only the negative side, of course. So you know, what you're saying then is that, you know, we've got to be careful not to overload Nietzsche too, and make him responsible for all sorts of things that he certainly would not have agreed with at all.
Well, I mean, look, ultimately Nietzsche is not responsible for the Holocaust. I'm not trying to suggest that he is. I'm simply saying that the reason that the Nazis did look affirmatively upon Nietzsche, even though Nietzsche, again, would not have agreed with the Nazis, not because of the Holocaust. He would have rejected the idea that any group outside of the Superman, again, society, the whatever moral values, whatever stability, whatever civilization is a function of the Superman in Nietzschean thinking. So, you know, one scholar called it aristocratic radicalism, right? Where the aristocrats have all the power and everyone else is expected to submit to that authority. You know, and so the point is that the leader principle, which is right, comes out of Smith, and is again full fruition in the Nazis and in Adolf Hitler, right? The leader principle is in line with Nietzschean thinking and the notion of the Superman, right? Again, the idea that people should be subservient to the Superman. And again, these are the people, the Supermen are the people that bring us culture and civilization and order, right? Again, expressly rejecting the Enlightenment, expressly rejection any notion of all men are created equal. Again, and following from that, any notion of democracy or universal human rights, etc.
Yeah. Well, thanks, George. They're good thoughts and plenty to explore.
Okay, thank you, John. Derek, your turn.
Yeah. Okay, so in defense of Nietzsche as the genius that he was, I mean, that he did have an underlying value that we need, because the values of our world are decrepit. We need something else. And he was, you know,
Whoops. Derek seems to have frozen. Pity.
Well, you'd agree with that, David, that we need values.
That his metaphors of the camel, the lion, and the child are metaphors. And in the child, he talks about, I mean, a being that is without the baggage that we all have, a being also that is self-willed. Now, it was earlier spoken about how can we get rid of this? How can we start to begin to get rid of these, find our way through the externals, the constraints of the external. I suggest that in one way, it's not such a problem. It's very easy. All you have to do is understand the historical, the sociological, and the psychological forces that are, you know, that we have to live with. Once we understand these things, we can say they are there and we can work against them. Just knowing that they're there, just knowing what they are, helps us to work against them. But also to be more liberated, I think, okay, that's something more, you know, abstruse. To be liberated, I mean, the animals are not. Humans have the potential of being so because we have a awareness, a self-consciousness that animals do not have. And in that awareness of self-consciousness, we can look towards the potentiality, at least. And in the potentiality, we can look forward. We can walk towards that that possible or greater degree of liberation. Okay, that's all I have to say.
Yeah, well, obviously you're making important points that we need to be honest about our reality and face up to it, not try to delude ourselves with all sorts of theories that aren't relevant. And we need to appreciate what we can do with our liberation from the animal world. I mean, I often feel very sorry for the animals that they can't go at night and watch TV or read Shakespeare or something. They're just, all day they're munching grass, and then at night they go to sleep somewhere, but they miss out on all our great literature. I mean, it's a funny thought I have, and I don't know if I'm the only one that has it, but I often feel sorry for animals that that they are just animals, that they can't get a chance to develop their intellects and their psyches and whatnot. Anyway, that's an interesting point you've got, that we are liberated from it, and that we should do our best to exercise our potential there. That the sky's the limit in that regard. I mean, every now and again I look up the Facebook or something like that, and then they put you onto these reels and things like that, and they just go on forever. I mean, you could spend your whole life just watching and not run out of things to watch. And the YouTubes, and I don't know how many thousands that get put up every day, but we're in a world just of such expanding intellect and knowledge that no one can keep up, and perhaps a lot of people are very dissatisfied by it. That they feel that they can just get a slight touch of this and that, and slight awareness of this, and but nothing in depth anymore. But anyway, I like your idea that we accept this liberation that we do have, and we explore our potentiality, to develop our wider interests and our intellects and appreciations of culture and whatnot. So thanks for that, Eric.
Thank you, John. Conrad, your turn.
Thanks. Great talk. Our first question is, was Nietzsche successful in creating many Übermensches, or was it, as some people have suggested, a future evolution of our species, and we need to in other words, he even knew that biologically we couldn't be an Übermensch except for a few people. So that's the first question. And then part of that is, how has it affected yourself?
Well, I think for a start, the Übermensch idea was very much his project. It was Nietzsche's project, and you don't really hear of other people that deliberately saying to the public, "Look, I've reached the stage of Supermensch, or Supraman, or the above man, the overman." But a lot of people have stood out as individuals that have made a great contribution. You think of the Nobel Prizes that have been put out. Well, I always think, well, there's some people that have made a good contribution to our world, but I can't understand most of what they're saying, but I accept that they are above me. So I just wonder whether Nietzsche was the only person who ever actually came to grips with it for himself subjectively and said, well, I reckon I can transvalue and I can be an Übermensch. But even with Hitler soon realized that he was far inferior than his earlier dreams, when he was sitting in his bunker and deciding at what stage he should shoot his brains out. So I just wonder if Nietzsche's the only one that's ever actually lived up to what he thought and what he said, and everybody else has made attempts to, perhaps, and failed, or some have made a reasonable attempt at it, but they don't go around bragging about it. So I don't know. It's just an interesting concept to throw around, really, that the whole idea of supermensch.
But didn't he like since that sounds like one of the most important teachings in quotes that he has to offer of all of his teachings, the most powerful, resonant one. Wouldn't he have been interested in his lifetime if anybody was influenced by that idea, and after being influenced, they actually became that? Otherwise, then he's talking about some future man in a million years.
Yeah, I don't know. We don't know those sort of details at all. I haven't seen him write up about what he thought secretly, you know, what he actually thought, or whether there were other people that were actually these Übermensch. But as I said, you know, everybody could claim in some way or other that they've been a bit beyond the general human run of things. Everybody could say that, you know. You can find something in your life that you've done that's unique and it's above the others. It's a very subjective sort of a thing, I think. Only Jung, Nietzsche might have made or wanted it to be more objective. But as far as I can see, is you know, where individuals look like they've adopted it, they've ended up in absolute disaster. You know, taking Hitler as a main example there.
What other examples? I mean, that one's always used, but it sounds like you have other examples in mind.
Well, I mean, as I've said, the Nobel Prize winners, intellectually, they are beyond me. So from my point of view, they're suprahuman at my humanity level, because they've made contributions and research stuff that I wouldn't understand a word of it. So I mean, it's such a flexible sort of subjective concept that Nietzsche made a lot of, but I doubt if too many others would be prepared to take it on and say, well, here, I'm the supermensch, I'm the Übermensch.
One final question.
Well, there's no answer to that one. I don't know. I don't think there is an answer, really.
Just a final follow-up, which is those Nobel Prize winners that you just mentioned. I would have thought that the Übermensch is not really about someone being particularly smart or inventing something or writing a great doctorate. I would have thought it would be something internal within themselves that's changed, something where they become a different type of human being, a more enlightened human being as such, rather than just some intellectual ability which was gifted to them.
Yeah, that's getting back to actually Nietzsche's idea that the inner, the inward, has priority over the outer, and he may have developed his inner and felt that was the essence of the Übermensch, and maybe others followed, but it's not something that's been written about. You know, people don't seem to say, well, I want to apply the Übermensch to my own life now. I've never seen any books on that.
Thanks, John.
I don't know, I might be wrong, but it's, you're asking interesting questions, but, it's very hard to get a grip of something that, for a start, is very subjective to Nietzsche, and how he actually dealt with it himself. We're not sure, except that he went mad. I don't know whether that was the cause of it. Who knows?
Stephen, your turn.
I'm wondering if a few things are overlooked. Like I said, I was trying to point out that people think this Nietzsche was this philosopher who was above everything that was everyday. But to a degree, when I checked him out, he seems to be immersed in the things that were concerning people in the 19th century. He was immersed in the science of the day, which seemed all powerful, all triumphant. If you lived in the 19th century, were you going to or late 19th century, were you going to disagree with science? No, it's no chunk had been taken out of science. But look, when we're talking about a humanity which will arise after this present kind of humanity, he was foreseeing the extinction of the present type of humanity and their values. The 19th century was a crisis in values. This is something he points out in The Madman. What's wrong with these academics? Don't they realise what this all means to the individual? You know, they used to believe, oh, okay, we know we die, but don't worry, you got this thing called the soul. You're going to fly up to heaven and live merrily with your values for eternity, because you've got this big dude called God who's going to arrange it for you. That went out the window. You know, the idea of man's origin. Oh, you're these creatures, you know, Adam and Eve, God made you, you erred a little and you're in this great drama cycle of receiving redemption again. That went out the window. There is now just brute reality, that's all. You know, he often commented upon Hamlet. You know, Hamlet's whole point, picks up the skull of Yorick and he sees his own death in it. Oh, there's this guy called Yorick. He was having a great time. Everyone was laughing. Now look at him. In other words, he was saying in terms of evolution, we have to look at ourselves and we are the dead to become. We are the evolutionary failures that are going to appear in the future geological strata. That's the interesting point, isn't it? This struggle with reality. This is the feeling I get from Nietzsche. He couldn't stand scientific fact. He inwardly rebelled against it, but at the same time, having a good mind and living in that time, he had to agree with it. He had no way out. But yeah, this is the thing. When he's talking about the Superman, he's basically saying present humanity is something that will be superseded. We're just the dead waiting to happen. Thank you.
Yeah, that's important about the dualistic thinking. That comes up in everything. I mean, where there's a unity, but then it doesn't take long. A unity is broken up into the duality or the pairing or pairing. But what creates a problem is when it becomes a paradox.
Okay.
When the two sides are just completely logheads with each other, and that then creates issues, and people like to tend to go back to a monism one way or the other. And perhaps Nietzsche actually found that he was caught up in the paradox of criticizing the West and the intellectuals and, you know, what the West had to offer, but at the same time thinking that they should improve their level of education, enlightenment, and intellect. So, you know, in 1 minute criticizing the same thing, and then the next minute promoting it. So, you know, you could say, well, you can't really have both. You can't promote and criticize something as basic as that. But that becomes a paradox then. They can't both be right. And I think there's probably more problems with paradox, and maybe that was what got to, in the end, got to Nietzsche, that he was caught up in paradox. That's a possibility. That's just my thinking from thinking about it and reading about it. But the overall talk today was that the paradox, in a way, was depicted by Kierkegaard on one extreme and Nietzsche on the other. And so we're bringing back together two people over against Nietzsche, who may have been very much caught up in a paradox like that. That sounds to me a very serious one, actually. You know, when you're critical of something, but yet you want to promote it. That's a paradox.
Thank you,
Anyway,
John.
and that's Christianity is full of paradoxes too, and we won't go into that. That could take another 10 hours of talk.
Well, that was a big problem, that one other issue, that Christianity guaranteed All of you have some value. You can be the lowest human being lying in the gutter, but to God, you still have some primary value. We don't, once you've thrown something like Christianity out the window, that no longer is, that the human being can become a zero. With God, he was always there nudging you along a bit and making you or giving you or being your parents and saying, there, little man, at the end of the day, I'm there, giving you a value, even if you can't give one yourself. But where does man get his values from once you've tossed God out the window?
Thank you, Stephen. James.
Yeah, thanks again, John. My question is, do you think Nietzsche was the issues he was dealing with were serious philosophical issues? And at one point, did he flirt with Buddhism? Because Buddhism, posits that the life is suffering, and he was, trying to work out that, work on that problem of suffering, and he, do you think he confronted it seriously, philosophically? Because he did engage with those, questions of life, and the thoughts of the Western, Western tradition of philosophy and religion and culture. So
Well,
for his idea. So yeah, just a follow up on that. That the idea that his idea of the Superman, would that be something like a contribution to philosophy and to the improvement of the individual as a subject who is more than just a member of the herd, right? Because when it comes to a good society, a democratic society, you really need people who are able to overcome their fantasies of worshiping a demigod and just becoming one of the herd, right? In order to make the right choices as to who will be their leader and so forth. So would that be a correct interpretation, that the Superman is a way of is a kind of an improvement over what man has been, and he could be much better able to think as an individual and make good decisions, um, based on individual thinking as opposed to being just a member of the herd. And herd mentality is really what he's railing against. And possibly, he might have been realistic and with foresight, that he saw that societies are, go down the drain because of this herd mentality, and that the human beings could do better if they could become individuals and think of individuals who can overcome their shortcomings and fantastic worshiping dictatorship thinking.
Yeah, the whole issue is that philosophy has really branched out into two main areas. You had, of course, on the one hand, the empiricists, donkey's years. And as I said, in the 1960s, I was studying philosophy over in Adelaide, and they were all on about logical positivists, A.J. Ayer, and soon after, physicalism emerged. But that was all very empirical, and you had to have the evidence in front of you, and it was very much reality testing in an empirical scientific sense. But you see, then along came Max Charlesworth, and he said, well, there's this European existentialism going on, but they're more concerned with values than physical reality.
In the meantime, we were getting lectures by Jack Smart on physicalism, and nothing else can exist apart from the physical. And Max Charlesworth was busy telling us that the issue is really values, subjective values and feelings and intuitions, and that had to be dealt with. At Melbourne University, it created quite a rumpus during the 1970s when you had the two schools going, and the physicalists and the logical positivists were saying that Max Charlesworth's philosophy wasn't philosophy; it was just playing games with ethics and values and things like that. But he kept at it, and was still existentialism is still basically dealing with choices, making choices, subjective choices, values, dealing with values, evaluating things, determining good and bad, right and wrong, beautiful, ugly, aesthetics. That's the area of ethology rather than the area of epistemology. So we've had these. I've seen it all. I've been going to these things now for the last 50 or 60 years or whatever. And that is the big division. And it was interesting that David Miller's sessions that he ran, he would have existentialism, and then we'd have Max Charlesworth dealing with some sort of ethical issues or aesthetic issues or something or other. Then we'd have Jack Smart talking to us about physicalism and how all that other was all just rubbish and bunkum. A waste of time, not philosophy. So what you're dealing with is something that is really part of philosophy, very much in the 19th century, in the way it's split into these two great divisions. And so I think with with Nietzsche, then he was also dealing with values. And I think you can see now that he's more in the subjective area, and so it's quite possible that he was exploring Buddhism and things like that. And that again matches the Jungian division between empiricism, which is sensation and thinking about it rationally, and the other half is feeling and intuition. They're subjective. So you've got the objective empirical side of philosophy and science, and then you've got the experiential and the subjective feelings and intuition. So both of those are needed. That's another very important area for balance. But you've still got the physicalists who are saying that all the answers are in physicalism, and the others who are saying don't worry about physicalism, only worry about values. Perhaps Nietzsche was caught up in that one. Anyway, that's just giving you a bit of an overview of what I've experienced since the 1960s. I don't know if it's right. You can always criticise it if you want to, but I think that's correct because I lived through it.
Thank you, John. Derek.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Perhaps I'm mistaken, but didn't Nietzsche somewhere view Buddhism as a negative outlook? I think he said something like that. I can't find exactly where he said that. I did think he did say something. This is a widespread view now that Slavoj Zizek also shares. Okay, that's just my first point on Buddhism that I share. But what about the moral Superman? The Superman, I mean, of course, for Nietzsche, the Superman is a moral being. It's not about qualities of, intelligence. And, we were discussing earlier about where are some examples of the moral Superman? Well, paradoxically, I think we can look to religious figures to find notions of the Superman, because in the religious figures we have okay, if you bypass their fictional, misleading ideas, still their spirit, which we cannot find in the modern world. You cannot find the religious spirit in the modern world because the religious conceptions that supported those feelings, those ideas are gone. We cannot, recapture them. But nevertheless, if we look to the saints, we have, I think we can find notions of, examples of the Superman. And of course, again, I'm not too sure again, but I don't think that Nietzsche ever described himself as a Superman. I mean, didn't he always put it in terms of other people like Zarathustra? And again, and then, it's interesting perhaps that, Nietzsche, he quite liked the idea of Jesus Christ. He didn't like the religion, but Jesus Christ, he never described himself as God. It was the church after him that described himself as God. So, we have these prophetic figures who are saying something like Jesus and Nietzsche, not presenting themselves, but presenting ideas that others should follow. I think.
Thanks for that. Good.
George, your turn.
Again, Nietzsche is not philosophy. Nietzsche is not even, you have to really, I'm going to say his writing is not coherent, but again, what you could pull from his reasoning is, on the one hand, he laments the end of religion. Now, and again, you're reading coherency in what he's arguing, okay? And so he laments the loss of religion because under religion, right, the king was the representative of God or the Pope. So people, in his mind, intuitively accepted the social order, right? They accepted the aristocracy as something ordained by God, right? And so his lamentation is, again, the Enlightenment, all men are created equal, the turn to secularism, because now people no longer view the social order as ordained by God and as something that is natural, and again, something simply to accept, just like, let's say, the laws of physics. And so on the one hand, he laments the death of God. On the other hand, he does fault Christianity for this process, precisely because Christianity leads to, he indicts Christianity as the basis of the Enlightenment. All men are created equal. We are all equal in the eyes of God. And so, again, this leads to the Enlightenment. This leads to concepts of universal equality. Now, again, the Übermensch in this context, because for Nietzsche, he's an anti-Enlightenment thinker. He rejects justice as a metaphysic or universal justice. And so, for figures like Nietzsche, the result is going to be chaos, right? So if we really, first and foremost, of course, people are not equal, Nietzsche would say, and of course, it is a moral political claim. It is not an empirical claim. But again, for Nietzsche, morality doesn't exist as the metaphysic. Justice doesn't exist as the metaphysic. And so, again, order has to be imposed by a Superman, a Superman class, a caste system, a violent state, where the priority is establishing order. And so, that's, this other stuff, there's never been a Superman. That just doesn't make any sense. My point would be is that a lot of these defenders of Nietzsche really are trying to obfuscate him and render him quite meaningless as any kind of thinker, right? But Nietzsche is critical of reason because there's nothing universal to reason, right? There's nothing universal to morality. There's certainly no moral reasoning that is universal and objective. Again, he rejects Hegel quite clearly. So, my simple point is that, Nietzsche is an anti-Enlightenment thinker that essentially argues that order must be maintained from above. And things like the Enlightenment, all men are created equal, these are corrosive, misguided ideas. Thank you.
John, did you want to?
That again is almost gets you to the paradox that we were talking about before, that Nietzsche didn't really trust the other people, that they could create their own values.
within Christianity, obviously, there was still a fairly conservative sort of Christianity in the 1800s, and people flocked to church. You know, by far the majority of people were happy to go along to church and hear the Bible being read and the preacher telling them all the 10 Commandments and all the other things that they're supposed to do. We're in a different world now, but at the same time, you see, you've got Nietzsche subjectively trying to sort out his own values, which he used as an example of what would be ideal or potentially valuable for the Übermensch, the suprahuman, not the superhuman, just the suprahuman. I'd rather call it that. And so there again, there's a sort of a paradox going that you've mentioned there. But you're certainly correct that there is a problem with principles, of basic principles of justice and things like that. They need to be taken into account, but they can often be ignored too. And people just make rules and values for their own personal interests. Not, you know, perhaps you could say Trump may be doing exactly that. Everything he's doing, really, if you boil it down, is for his own interests. You know, promoting his idea that he's ruling the universe. Well, he's certainly affecting every country with his tariffs. So, I mean, maybe that's is predominantly a subjective sort of a thing. It's to boost his feeling of importance. He's not worrying too much what it's going to do to the economy. He's still bragging on about how it's going to be brilliant for the economy, but obviously with tariffs, everybody's going to have to pay a hell of a lot more money for things if there's a tariff that also has to be paid for. Well, I mean, he's in a dreamland, and but you make important points as always, George. I accept that you know you've given these things a lot of thought, but I'm just wondering about perhaps there's another paradox that Nietzsche was unable to deal with, and we shouldn't be too hard on him. Perhaps feel sorry for him that he got himself caught up in these sort of situations, that he found that really in the end he couldn't deal with, and ended up in a mental hospital.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to comment on that, but you know, just looking at his, you know, his arguments, what I would say is that the anti-enlightenment, and again, this is the Uberman, this kind of thing, operating through fantasies. Trump operates through fantasies. Hitler operated through fantasies, right? The Aryan race, the idea that you could overcome, Germany could defeat the Soviet Union. This fantasy that somehow tariffs are going to somehow, you know, do something affirmative for the American economy in particular. But the other side to this is that, of course, we do see in Hitler, we do see in Trump, is this leader principle idea. And certainly it's true, and it's fair to say that Nietzsche did not articulate the leader principle concept. Again, that it can be more proximately attributed to Carl Schmitt, and then taken the full bore by the Nazis. And again, something that Trump is openly admired. But nevertheless, I mean, I'm simply going to say that Nietzsche with the Superman, again, we could see the sort of the beginning of this argument that order has to be established from above, right? Again, it's a basic distrust of humanity, of people. Again, you know, thinking that all men are created equal, democracy, these things are fundamentally misguided, Nietzsche believed. The other thing I'll add very quickly is that, you know, Nietzsche, again, and he talks out of both sides of his mouth. On the one hand, lamenting the end of religion. On the other hand, condemning Christianity. And the reason he condemns Christianity, we've talked about, he rejects universalist religions. Christianity, Islam, Buddhism. Nietzsche would reject all of those precisely because, again, they speak of the universalism of humanity. Everyone, you know, in the Buddhist case, everyone can achieve enlightenment, right? Everyone's equal in the eyes of God. You know, and ultimately what I'm going to say is, I'll just conclude on this point, is that, and this is one reason why nationalists are so attracted to Nietzsche, is this notion of tribalism, right? So he rejects universalism, and instead each tribe, if you will, or nation would be managed or led or organized by, you know, their respective Ubermen. Thank you very much. Thank you for allowing me my extended comments. Thank you, John. Thank you.
Conrad, it's your turn.
Yeah, just to respond this first to George, you said Nietzsche was the idea that I think you said order needed from above, and then you said in relation to that the related idea is democracy is misguided, and you're saying that's incorrect. Where obviously maybe Nietzsche and Hobbes disagree with you, but then you have to ask yourself the question: if democracy is so great, then you should be loving the United States of America. And yet I've heard many critical comments from you and many others correctly, which is, as far as I've been told, a democracy. And if someone was to argue and say, well, that's a failed democracy. No, that is democracy. So maybe democracy, in the seeds of democracy, is its doom, as evidenced by the world that we're living in now. Anyway, I just wanted to make it, and then a question for John. So we got the Enlightenment, in quotes, the Enlightenment. Breaking away from the tyranny of dogma and religion, and then you're talking about the Übermensch, and think about the word the Enlightenment and then take away the word the off. So it's enlightenment. Now we all know that Eastern philosophy, especially Buddhism, but many Zen, which came to America in the 70s, one form of Buddhism, and many others, all the New Age religions, Eckhart Tolle, Deepak Chopra, all of those people are all about trying to become enlightened. Now, question for you is this, John. So modern 20th century alternative spiritual people wanting to become enlightened, like Buddha 2,000 years ago, and then you have Nietzsche saying he invented the Übermensch, and yet isn't enlightenment exactly the same? That's my question for you.
There's one thing that we have done wrong, I think, here today is to forget that Nietzsche was dealing with Übermensch in the context of his herd mentality. I mean, obviously, when George mentions from above, the order from above, that was the order for the herd mentality. They needed everything to be told to them, everything from the external. And it's as if that drove Nietzsche to the opposite and said, well, look, we have to stop this idea that we've got this herd mentality. There's people are prepared to be just animals and be told what to do, and they just experience things as they're supposed to. And so his opposite was very much a subjective Übermensch for the individual, and in his case, with being Nietzsche, it was to see himself with a view of valuations slightly above the rest of humans at that stage. So I think we're forgetting to deal with that contrast that Nietzsche was dealing with when he's dealing with the herd mentality and the Übermensch, and so the order from above may not, in fact, apply so much to the Übermensch or the supra human. That enlightenment has allowed the person to find the light. Now, the best example of this are the Gnostics. In the 1st century, this was before Christianity, you had these Gnostic groups, who had followed Plato's view of the cosmos, and one of the aspects of cosmology was the light from the sun, and then the light that was from the beyond the sun and from the unknown source. And it was the whole idea of the Gnostics was to gain knowledge, how to get through all the spheres in the sky to the light beyond the sun. And that light was the ultimate knowledge and gnosis. And so the whole idea of gnosis was to learn what code were needed, what code word was needed to get past through the planets, the spheres of the planets, and then the zodiac, and then the path of the beyond the zodiac, and then to this light in heaven. That was their whole life, was to somehow obtain this light. Now Christianity came along, and they said, "Oh, we know all about the light. That's Jesus." And so Jesus became the light of the world, and the literalists completely turned their back on all the Gnostic ideas, except that they came into John 11 deals with the routine of the ritual of Osiris and Isis, and John takes up the name of Isis, which is Mary, M-E-R-I, and Osiris is El-Assar, another way of pronouncing it, and they turned that into Lazarus and Mary. And so Mary Magdalene and Osiris then are part of the ritual where Osiris was put into or Lazarus was put into a cave in a ritual, initiation ritual, and then Jesus came along and said, "Oh, we're not in a big hurry." So eventually he came out of the grave, and at the same time they borrowed Isis as Mary Magdalene, but then they needed a second person, or they introduced a second person, and she was Martha, and people have always wondered who that was. And in fact, it was the friend of Osiris. There was the wife and consort Isis, and there was Nephthys. That was a friend, sort of a helper or whatever, and she was called Merti, and so John called her Martha. And so John actually made use of the Isis-Osiris initiation ritual in John 11, and the Christians have turned that into the resurrection of Lazarus, and they're the literalists then say, well, now you just believe that that's the story. Well, of course, it's actually myth historicized. And so this Enlightenment was very, very powerful at this early time, and a lot of the religions, the mystery religions, were on a quest to absorb this light, to actually take part in this distant light. And once they had that, they felt that they had the light of knowledge, of life, and it's where people don't look into this Gnostic business, which was before Christianity, because they're quite happy with their literalism. They're the herd mentality, and they were called the lowest level of thinking, the literalist levels. Whereas then the higher levels were psychic, pneumatic, and Gnostic. And in the first century and the second century, it was very the Gnostics were very keen to get to this higher stage. But of course, then when Constantine authorized Christianity as a religion, then they just burnt all the Gnostic books that they could find. But we're digging a few up now in different places in Egypt, and finding out now about the Gnostics and their quest for the knowledge of the great light, the distant light. And that was part of the Enlightenment, and that's been going for the last 2,000 years. They're after this light. Anyway, that just gives you a little bit of background. I don't know if it's all that relevant, but it's very important, and I think people just ignore that. They think the story of Lazarus' resurrection is all literal history, but it's all historicized myth by the early Christians.
Conrad, did you want to respond?
No, that was wonderful. I'm just absorbing that.
Good.
you.
Okay. Stephen, your turn.
I'm just going to be a bit critical of this use of the term essence. I mean, essence is a term which has come to us from ancient times when they used to believe in God. Essence is the theory that we know what something is in its inner nature, in its inner being, that we know what it is. But yes, there is a concept called essence, and that's a theory. I have a theory of what a man is, or I have a theory of what this is, or this substance. There's an essence in this substance. Its essence always refers to ideas, to theories. So this is a problem with Kant. When Kant said, well, we don't really know the thing in itself, Schopenhauer was a little bit critical of Kant in that point and said, there has to be something of direct reality coming into our experience. Yeah, maybe 99.99% of it is just perception and conception, but there has to be some element of reality we directly experience, of existence, reality. But essence, no. Essence is an idea and always will be an idea. Now, that's troublesome for our modern times. It wasn't troublesome for the older types of humanity because they had the all-powerful God. Well, I might not directly experience the essence. I might only have a theory of it, but God will directly experience the essence and create the essence and do all that. Everything was just roses while I still had God as a placeholder. But then when the 19th century came along and they kicked God out the door, then all these philosophical problems started to show up and the academics ignored them. I mean, the interesting thing about Nietzsche is he accused his fellow academics of being shallow, of being superficial because they weren't noting the problems. They were ignoring them. They thought they can continue with an ancient conception of the world when they've pulled the rug out from under it. But I'm just wondering, John, what can you say of this concept of essence? Is it simply a theory, or can we directly experience something of essence?
Well, my experience of philosophy since the 1960s is that there have been ontological theorists who assume that there is an issue of being, of essence, not just a concept, not just an idea, but Heidegger wrote whopping big books about it all. He wasn't writing just about a vague fantasy. Ontology has been an important philosophy. Existentialism became more practical, looking at more subjective things like choice making and existing, how to exist.
Sorry, Don, I'm not denying there is such a thing as an essence, but I'm saying we can only conceive of it as a theory. That's my point.
Oh, well, we can deal with it with a theory, or we can say it's factual. I mean, that depends on the practitioner. You see, then you've got epistemology, which of course is the whole issue of scientific methodology and how do we have knowledge, and how can we confirm knowledge and all that. All these things are running together. I think that debate at the Melbourne University didn't really get very far because Max Charlesworth kept doing his existential philosophy, and the others kept doing their epistemological and ontological philosophy. So they're all working together. Philosophy. What's the definition of philosophy? There's a love of wisdom. Well, I mean, it doesn't tell you exactly what line of wisdom. So I think we've got to keep a pretty open mind there, Stephen. And I wouldn't argue too much about whether we say essence is an image or a concept or a reality or whatever. Right, it'll depend on the practitioner.
Okay, John, do you agree that existence precedes essence?
Well, to an existentialist, yes, but an ontologist would say no. Essence precedes existence.
In other words, my ideas about something precedes the actual existence.
Yeah, but then your ideas turn into your theory, and they become your life philosophy. And if you're a philosopher, then you'll spend the rest of your life on one or the other, or if you want to, you can do the whole three.
But do you reckon the idea about something precedes its existence?
Sorry, I missed that one.
Do you believe the idea of something precedes its existence?
That'll be up to the people working on ontology, wouldn't it? They'll come up with different views.
Okay,
so it may be for me an open issue. You know,
who has the idea that precedes existence?
Well, there's ideas and there's realities. Yeah,
it used to be God, but we tossed God out the window. Created a few philosophical problems.
So it's going to create issues, and that's what we do today. We've got all these different schools of philosophy.
Okay, John, I don't think you understand what essence means. Thank you.
Well, I don't think Heidegger understood what essence means. He wrote books on being, but when they asked him what it really meant, what did he say? What could he say? Anyway.
James, your turn. Unmute yourself, James. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Hi again, John. Wanted to ask the question: would would democracy be more likely to be a true democracy if it was under the principle that everybody, all people are men or whatever, all people are created equal, which sounds like, treating people as part of a herd, or would they be more? It would be better to have a principle of more enlightened people, right? Where you have a number of enlightened people who might, Nietzsche would call them supermen or superwomen or whatever, and they would at least, not be ruled by this herd mentality.
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah, Nietzsche was caught up in people that were part of the herd mentality. As I mentioned, in the 1800s, church attendance was almost compulsory. And the churches then they were the official keepers of records of births, marriages and deaths and all that. So more or less the government was happy for them to be the official registrars. But then that during the 20th century, the 1900s, obviously that changed. And now with very few people going to churches, to church services and that sort of thing, that just wouldn't work now. But and they were obviously becoming in a situation where people have to make up their own minds. What ethics are they going to choose? What aesthetics is going to suit them? So where if ever there was a time for important choices to be made, it's now. Where more and more opportunities to make choices, but also more responsibilities to make them. Where we haven't got God up there, and we haven't got the preacher preaching to us every Sunday. We're confronted with these judgments and that we have to make for ourselves in our own lives. And we can hope that they're positive, but unfortunately for a lot of people, they get caught up in the negatives and they have no respect at all for society and go around and with their knives and whatnot and burgle and steal cars and all that sort of thing. So some bad decisions and choices are being made, but people are making a lot more choices now than they were making in the 1800s, especially in regard to values that Kierkegaard was so concerned about. Probably in Denmark at the time he was there, the same thing applied. Just about everybody went along to church every Sunday.
it was up to 90% or something like that. It was a very high figure of people that attended. So anyway, I think that with a democracy, you need educated people who are going to accept the responsibility of making choices. So that obviously, it'd be good if they were all uber mensch or supra human in the sense that they take on the positive responsibilities. That would be good. And democracy demands it. We're always being told that we should make sensible choices and get educated and find out about what the policies are. So we certainly would rather not have a herd mentality. We would rather have in our democracy people that are being educated and enlightened to make the correct or the best decisions. That's what's happening now. You know, we're not worrying about what Nietzsche's time, he had his problems, but we're worrying now about now where we need enlightened and educated democratic residents and electors.
Derek, go ahead.
Right, okay, good. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, of course. Yeah, what was I going to say? Yes, of course, Nietzsche described things like essences as the illusion of the world behind the scenes, unquote. And the modern world has followed him in this. I mean, Wittgenstein, argued against having one property of something by which we could define things with his complex theory of meaning. Modern science doesn't think about what things are in terms of their essences, in terms of things about, well, what does it do in terms of its function, its properties like mass or weight or whatever, or length or breadth. So, essences is an ancient idea. It's simply, unmistaken that you might want to make use of if you're in the Catholic Church and you want to explain the transubstantiation because you're taking, Aristotelian metaphysics to explain it. But there is no such, in my view, and I think in the view of modern people, there is no such thing as essences. And just because Sartre said existence precedes essence doesn't mean that he believes in essences. He's just engaging with an argument that he doesn't hold.
Thanks, that's another perspective. Thanks for that. Yeah.
Did you want to respond further, George, to Derek, John?
No, I think that's good. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering, John, what you thought of Kierkegaard's position, because it seems his concepts around existentialism arose when he attended Schelling's lectures. When Schelling was sent by the authorities to do a hatchet job on Hegel, the devil himself. And, some might have complained in Schelling they were sending actually somebody who believed in God, which was a horrifying thought, but for some reason they sent Schelling. And one of the things that Schelling was trying to point out, and this is what really grabbed Kierkegaard, was they seem to have forgotten that reality precedes ideals. This is it. We live in a world which is so, well, Hegel, he said, was, the really bad example of a guy that was so caught up in ideas that he forgot reality. This is the point. He said, you always got to come back to this. Reality precedes our ideas about it. We are not God, basically. And this was his warning, and this was the thing that really kicked it off in Kierkegaard, as far as I know. If you've ever investigated Schelling's 1840 lectures, I think it was, the curious thing, of course, that Engels was also present at the lectures. But this was the thing that kicked it off. This seems to have been the moment which kicked off the existentialism with Kierkegaard. So I'm wondering, are you aware of the 1840 lectures?
No, I haven't been checking up on Google just at the moment on that. You've obviously got some interesting sources there. I have only come across more the context of his Lutheranism. His parents were very devout Lutherans, and you can imagine in the middle of the 1800s that they would have made sure that they took their son to their church services, and that he did his confirmation and believed all the doctrines and all that sort of thing. And of course, he would have found it hard to surrender the externalism that he was just struggling with, because of the external laws being imposed on him and the pressure from the family and all this sort of thing. And I'd say I share that exactly. I know what he would have gone through if, in fact, that was one of the problems. But you're digging up stuff on the internet about Schelling and Hegel and all that sort of thing. Well, you'll have to explore a bit more to see what the answer to your question is about that. But I suppose with ideals and reality, you can get caught away. You can get caught and sort of drift off with the problem of ideals and lose reality altogether. And that's what they're saying Trump has done. He's got all his ideals now, and but unfortunately, he's completely lost reality.
Well, another example is Schopenhauer, the will rather than the representations. You believe, I think you just said that you believe in the Enlightenment, that there's a set of perfect ideals out there which we'll discover one day, which will fix everything up. And I think you'll find that existentialism poo-poos that entire idea. For starters, it takes a will to create. You can have all the ideas in the universe, and they will achieve nothing without a will. And is there such a thing as a perfect set of ideas for humanity? Really? That there is such a measure out there? I mean, George keeps on railing on about equality. I mean, that's just an abstract consideration. There is, in reality, no equality between human beings. The potentials are all, they can all go in different directions. George is a hard case. There has to be equality, or we will make you equal. It's a bit like that Greek god that tended to chop off people that were too tall and stretch the people out that were too short. I will make you all equal.
Okay, well, I'll cut you off there because I don't want to fight between you and George on the show. With the Enlightenment, I explained before that in the first century, Enlightenment was very clearly getting the ultimate light, the cosmic light that was there that would answer all your questions and solve all your problems and tell you everything.
Okay, the Gnostics.
Well, you call it nonsense, but for them, have some empathy for a bit. It was a supernatural realm they were living in, and so that's what they were experiencing and believing. But with the Enlightenment that you're talking about obviously the 17th century empirically based Enlightenment, which stressed rational thought, natural laws, principles, and it's a completely opposite world. So Enlightenment has held that earlier meaning very, very seriously, and it's to the extent that Jesus ended up calling himself the light of the world. And in fact, he became the light of the universe, actually, the king of the universe, from a little baby. But your Enlightenment that you're concerned about is a scientific one. There you're bringing in Bacon and Newton and Locke and all those the philosophers that were trying to get back to principles that would help them to analyze natural reality, not a supernatural realm. So you've got to be careful you don't mix up your realms there, Stephen. And but I'll bring you back
I
to
certainly
earth.
wasn't talking about the Gnostics.
Well, I was, and I'm trying to show you that enlightenment needs to be looked at in a broader context.
Okay, they were the real Enlightenment, not the later bods that came along.
Why do you have to evaluate it and give a value to it that suited them in the early days, and the 17th century one is what we're living in now?
Oh, we're living in. It's
We're-
gone
we
out the
are.
window, I think.
Oh, that's what you say. I mean, you keep saying that, and I just say, oh, well, you know, let him
Well,
say what he likes. Who cares?
Enlightenment's destroyed itself.
But it's still working.
Spengler has spoken.
You ask Les Allen, he'll say it's still working.
Thank you.
Yeah, you should talk to Les Allen one day.
Conrad, it's your turn.
Yeah, just to comment on what Stephen was saying first. I think you're a little bit concerned. You're overly, in my opinion, overly concerned about this particular time and place in existence. And so it's very easy to interpret this world, which a lot of people do, and everyone and say how terrible it is. You know, we can look at the political system. I think John was mentioning Trump in many different ways, and then George was mentioning the oppressed and all that, and it's easy to forget that we are constrained as a human being. Like everything that we are is how we were meant to be, and we're on this path of evolution. And I think what humans get concerned with is if we look at the world and we see it as a reflection of ourselves, because we are a human being. Those people who made the world the way it is are human beings, and therefore we judge ourselves and all the other human beings, all the bad ones, as very evil people, and thus it must mean that our nature is evil. You know, if you look around, it's very easy to see how things went wrong. But I think we need to remember that, yes, things went wrong, but it doesn't mean anyone was a bad person. Everyone was influenced into their badness, right? That's my view. And then I just have a quick question for John again, which is sort of related. This is my question, which I wrote down. My first question to you is: are you a determinist, or do you have free will? That's the first quick question.
Oh, well, that depends on context. You know, you've got free will in the intellectual realm, but in determinism, there's so much determined in our reality that you know, that the whole point of today's talk was to show that each are going to confront and create issues in different contexts, but then you've got to try to somehow bring them together. That's been my argument, that they're not two independent systems that can never be brought together. And even though some of the religions have tried, you know, I mentioned about the determinism of providence. Well, you listen to a fundamentalist Presbyterian preaching, and they'll just keep telling you how absolutely helpless all humans are, because nothing they do is their own free will. It's all determined by God, and so you know, everything is going to be dealt with in a particular context, but somehow or other we have to move above those contexts and just to see, well, what's the overall picture. But you can make cases for determinism, you can make cases for complete free will, but in the end there's going to be problems, and then you need to do some adjusting.
Let me just.
I'm not prepared to say I'm one or the other. I mean, I'm both.
Okay,
so in various situations. Yeah.
You're saying that in some aspects, in some places, you are making free choices. So this is my question to you then. which I wrote down. If someone has free will, then what are the inputs that determine their choice? In other words, if someone is making a choice, thinking, feeling, sensing, and then they say, hey, I chose this. My question is, well, what did you base your decision on? Therefore, defeating free will. So let me just summarize. So if someone makes a choice, I would ask them, did you base your decision on some things? And they'll go, yes, of course I did. And then I'll say, that's determinism. Can you argue with that?
Yeah. I mean, this whole talk was dealing with someone like Kierkegaard who wanted to base all his thinking on externals, on the external realm. And you've got Nietzsche, who was saying, well, I want my whole system to be dealt with in terms of internal phenomena, internal world, and my potential to be as an Ubermensch. So again, you see, you can't just create a duality and then turn it into a paradox. It doesn't happen. It happens. Christianity's caught up in endless paradoxes, and that's their problem. But we don't want to be caught up in the paradoxes, and so we'll deal with them as dualities, as polarities. Polarities are simply two poles. They're not in conflict. They're just two poles. One's on top of the world and one's at the bottom. They're polarities. They're dualities, but we mustn't turn them into paradoxes and make them irresolvable. That's our task. And I think you can. What I've argued is that what you're asking now, what's the basis? Each of those, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, both wanted an absolute, almost an absolute basis in one or the other, which is impossible, which I've tried to demonstrate.
Yeah, I mean, like Nietzsche, this supposed Superman or Supraman, when he creates his great life and makes his great decisions, they're always based on something. You don't just.
He's in the worldview. He's in the world. He has an a worldview. You see, Weltanschauung. They Germans like to call it that. Weltanschauung, it's called. Yeah. So don't create paradoxes out of it. That's what I say.
All right. Thanks, John.
Les, it's your turn.
Thanks. If you're wondering why I have facilitator next to my name, it's because when I facilitated a session a few days ago, I must have clicked on remember this name for future Zoom sessions, and I can't change the name now, so sorry about that. Just quickly on free will before I get to essences. So on Conrad's point about having reasons for action, and you're asking someone, what were your reasons to do X? We commonly think that having the capacity to think through reasons and give reasons is actually a precondition for acting freely. Someone who's got a very big mental disability and actually can't think through for doing X or Y and does it automatically, they're paradigm cases where we think people don't act freely. So the ability to be able to think through reasons, give reasons for action is actually a precondition for free will. To answer Carly's question, is determinism restricted from free will? And about Daniel Dennett and Robert Sapolsky. Daniel Dennett was a compatibilist. He thought that free will was compatible with determinism. Robert Sapolsky is a hard determinist, meaning he rejected free will and is a determinist. So they two hold. Daniel Dennett and Robert Sapolsky hold two quite different views, even though both of them are determinists. To get on to essences, I think that there's some value, a lot of value in talking about essences. I mean, the scholastics thought and argued long and hard about what essences are. So at that time, thinking through, they were thinking through what are the necessary attributes of something like a man, and how are they different from the contingent attributes, the things that a thing could have or not have. So they were thinking through very deeply about the nature of necessity and contingency, and that continued through, well, actually to the early 1900s, where we developed our modern logics and clarified very much the notions of necessity and contingency. But the question of do things have essences still carries on. And I'm thinking that there's still a lot of sense in that. Like with Aristotle, he thought the essence of a man, a human being, was a rational animal. And we, in epistemology, philosophy of science, there are some who think that things do have essences, but man is one of those complicated cases where there isn't a simple essence. I think they call it cluster essences, where the essence of a man is a cluster of attributes. But there are, I think, simpler cases, like, for example, water. I think most of us would agree that the essence of water is H2O. Water is constituted by being two molecules of hydrogen and one molecule of oxygen combined in a chemical structure. And I think the whole of the Mendeleev's periodic table that specifies for hydrogen one atom and one electron, helium protons, two protons, two neutrons and two electrons. So I think the periodic table tells us what the essence of each of the chemical elements are. And this is a simpler notion, I think, that illustrates that some things do have essences. So I still find some sense in talking about essences. I see you laughing away there. It is seriously held by quite a few philosophers of science. My professor, Brian Ellis, he argues for essences, and I can see a lot of sense in what he's saying. Thanks.
John, did you want to respond?
Oh, no, it's fine. It sounds good.
Okay. Stephen.
Sorry. I'm just arguing that point about this is where science affected Nietzsche's thought. He lived in the world of the 19th century, which was almost infinitely confident in scientific opinions. And according to the science, which, well, it's actually was getting a little bit dated in time, but it's probably the science he learned, was they called it Laplace's demon. And, this was the idea, for example, if someone knows the precise location or momentum of every particle in the universe, their past and future values for any given time are entailed. They can be calculated from the laws of classical mechanics. And this theoretical demon is a mind so vast that it can know the position and momentum of every particle in the universe. Therefore, it could predict every future condition. This was a common belief in the 19th century. I don't know, it might be the common belief today for all I know. But this was what depressed Nietzsche. When he saw that, he realized everything I am is just a product of these little atoms rolling around, One's going to bounce off one way and then my future is foretold. Do you see that as a huge problem for somebody with the sensitivities of Nietzsche, that all is humanity, everything's just a load of little billiard balls bouncing around? Now, tell me that the Kantian Laplace view of the cosmos was not the prevailing one for a period of time, because that was the one that Nietzsche was steeped in, and that was the one which depressed him. Thank you.
John?
Oh, again, Steve's looking up stuff there, and pretty specific. He'll need to look at the for the answer in his great list of.
That's fair enough, John. I wouldn't expect you. You could perhaps review it another day, you know.
Yeah.
Okay. And
No,
it's probably
I mean,
a bit tiring that you've been giving us a good lecture, and
oh no, that's not. You know, you're digging up stuff that's very specific, and you know, I'm a bit more generalist.
okay. Thank you.
If that's any good to you.
Marcus, go ahead. Whoop. Unmute yourself again.
Am I
Right.
here now?
Yep, you're there.
Great. I want to say thank you for the talk, and the idea that I was kind of pondering from what you brought up was how there is, through the story of Zarathustra, there is, in my opinion, some engagement with moving from the internal to the external world. How in the start, Zarathustra is in his cave after his 10 years of solitude, and now he's grown heavy with this honeyed wisdom, and he must put it into the hands of another. And towards the start, he goes towards that town, the cow of something, it doesn't matter. And he attempts to speak, and he attempts to preach to the people, and they simply laugh at him. They watch the jester, the clown, fall off of the tightrope, and it kind of prompts him that he must reflect, and he must renew and refine his efforts to try to reach the people with his wisdom that he's trying to. So to me, it seems like there is some degree of a dialectic between the internal and the external world that he's engaging with, and towards the end, it's obviously it's open interpretation, but it seems as if it's a cycle. How the end of Zarathustra is Zarathustra emerging from his cave again, and he's simply in the same he's in the same position that he was at the start. And to me, it kind of makes you think about there's this necessity to engage with a leap of faith, in its own sense, not with an eternal divine in the Kierkegaardian sense, but in order to be able to go about this project that Nietzsche is undergoing his life's work of the overman, to try to create better conditions to overcome nihilism, to create life-affirming values. It seems as if for not only Nietzsche himself but for others to follow this line, we must also engage in a certain type of leap of faith, knowing that Nietzsche speaks of the Übermensch as humans as a bridge towards the Übermensch that currently does not exist. He doesn't think of himself as the Übermensch. He thinks of it as something that will come into being into the future. And I don't know. I just think this idea, he in some ways, I am seeing an idea of him engaging with the leap of faith. Him engaging with this. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought at the first part, but this dialectic between the internal and the external.
John?
Oh yeah, it's very good that you brought up the the issue of the dialectic, because that really involved any polarity or duality, in the sense that you've got a thesis, then an antithesis, and of course then an integrating and synthesizing synthesis. And that concept fits in very well with what we've done today. It's like the underlying basic principle to what we've been discussing, the dialectic, this dialectical process.
So that, thanks for bringing that up. It's very good. The other thing is Stephen has mentioned the problem of us being just atoms and chemicals and things like that. Well, I think that's one of the reasons why so many people haven't given up the belief in God. You know, they've been taught it in Sunday school and in church, and they've assumed that this things are here, things are in existence because there was a personal God behind it who cared and thought it'd be nice to have humans on Earth, humans who I can go down and help and give them a land like the Holy Land or whatever. So they have very much personalised the whole thing, and over against a world without God, and that is, of course, they say, oh, well, it's just chemicals and material, and you know, they've lost this personal element, and so that could be actually a problem in regard to you know, why people are wanting to hang on to a personal God, and there's so many thousands of them, and so there's a lot of people are hanging on to these sort of personal type gods up in the sky somewhere. The other point I was making, you mentioned the leap of faith, and it's always important to remember that this making choices is a big leap, because quite often, you know, you'll hear women saying, oh, you know, if their partners, they've lost their partner or something like that, their biggest problem is making choices. You know, they like to discuss it. They like to look at all the different points of view. And then when they're suddenly faced with buying new curtains or buying new carpet or something like that, and they're the only one in the house, it becomes the biggest drama in their lives, you know, making the correct choices. And so I sort of see it quite important that we see that the leap is a tremendous leap to make a choice. And that's where the confidence and trust comes in yourself, that you'll not only make a choice, but you'll make the best choice you can possibly make. You know, we might think, oh, what's choosing? You know, choosing one ice cream or another. But when it comes to it, there are big issues that we need to choose between in life, and I think that's very appropriate, that it becomes a leap of trust or confidence rather than, you know, there's a word leap of faith or belief, which is very misleading. That's really nothing to do with this level of leap that was needed. Anyway, I know that's not often misunderstood, but I was very pleased when I read someone trying to explain this. That the leap of faith had nothing to do with leap of belief. It was belief and confidence that you can make those decisions that you need to make. Anyway, that's just a few responses that I would make.
Thank you, John. Les.
Thanks. John, I think the biggest thing I got from your talk today was, how do we live freely? How do we live with integrity? And how do we live autonomously? How can we make free choices? And I think there's been some discussion on that. I was doing other stuff while I was listening, so I'm not sure how much you talked about this, but what I'm saying, this is I found the most valuable part of your talk. And my thinking on this, how do we live freely? How do we enable our autonomy? Is, I think there's two factors. One is to study the factors that condition our choices. So study history, study psychology, study sociology, and study cognitive biases, especially. I mean, that's part of psychology and maybe philosophy, logic. Study cognitive biases, because it's the cognitive biases that distort our thinking from a rational way of choosing. So that's the first thing I think we need to live a life of freedom and autonomy. Study those factors that condition our behaviors. The second thing is, when we're making a serious life choice, like where to live, who to marry, what job to take, what career to pursue, to question seriously why you are making that choice. What are the factors that are leading you to make that choice? And are you going along with those factors? Are you going along with, are you choosing rationally according to your fundamental values? And are your values and beliefs conditioned so that they're not in line with what you really want? You know, I run the Ex-Religious Support Network, so I talk a lot to people who are literally brainwashed. They think they're choosing freely, but they're not. They're living highly constricted artificial lives. And many complain after they've come out of their sect that they've lost decades of their life because they weren't acting in a way, well, basically that was rational. So I think they're the two key factors in leading a life of freedom and autonomy, studying those factors that condition our behaviours and asking seriously the questions for why you are choosing X or Y. Now, I'm wondering what other people think of that, and John, as of course, you as well, most importantly.
Well, those two are very important, making rational choices and also taking into account the wider context, the world, history, your own psychology, preferences. What more can we say? You tend to say everything.
Okay, John. Conrad.
Yeah, I'll just try and reply to Les in part and to Stephen with this, well, Stephen, in relation to this strange persistence in many people somehow thinking that if you're a determinist, or people who don't believe in free choice, that for some reason you'd be depressed, or Nietzsche was depressed because all his human values were just billiard balls. Well, first of all, there's no reason that he would need to believe in the billiard board theory to believe that he has no choice. There could be other reasons that there's no choice. Providence, hand of God, other forces. But just getting to you mentioned, Les, you said, I wrote it down, how can we make free choices? How can we live freely to enable autonomy? And you recommended to study the factors and cognitive biases that affect our choices. Now, this is what I put out to the group. All of that is 100% compatible with determinism. There's no reason why you cannot throw out free will and still live your life freely. In fact, John was talking about paradoxes existing. That is the perfect example of a paradox where you can't necessarily reconcile determinism and free will. Well, I'm trying to, and in my belief, even that once you realize that this whole universe that you're this a tiny little part in, why is it so important that people have to have free will to make choices? Why is this obsession in society about these two very awful things, choices and responsibility? Is that not the cause of 50% of the suffering in the world? People having low self-esteem, self-criticism, people who go to psychotherapy, they're largely going there for self-doubt. Why would you have self-doubt if there was nothing you could have done differently? In fact, anyone's past, why would you ever feel bad about that? If that was providentially given to you. That was your destiny, your fate. But anyway, just to wrap up, I think you can have free will and determinism in the sense, even if you don't think you have free choice, you still have free choice, because this fake illusion that you'd be nihilistic if you were a determinist, that only proves determinism. That's a complicated idea, but if you actually believe, well, now there's no point doing anything because it's all determined. I mean, if you're a free will person and you're having that argument, that would actually prove determinism. So, in other words, if everything is destined, which I believe it is, you still play out your role. You still play out your life, and you're very blessed if you make good decisions and work hard. They're the two things you can do. Les, you were mentioning that whole list of things. That whole list of things is being wise, and when you have the wisdom, you have to work hard. You can't have one without the other. And if you're blessed, you will do those two things. And if you're not blessed, you won't. So if you're a determinist, there would be no reason why you would make any less effort, because that's an almost absurdity. That's complete madness. That it's like you're living your life, and then you finally discover there's no free will, and it's like, okay, I put my hand up, I give up. There's nothing I can do. There's no point making an effort anymore. It's just absurd. Anyway, it's a complicated idea. I'm still trying to grapple with it myself. Anyway, I'll leave it to the next person to have a comment.
Conrad, you seem to be a fellow multi-determinant. So the multi-determinant position, which I hold. Anyway, Stephen, it's your turn. I don't think John wanted to.
I could perhaps just say that it looks like that both these issues have two different contexts. One is when you're dealing with free will and free choice in the context of modified and syncretistic model, or you can have an absolutist, an elemental or an elementary model, which tends to deal with problems each individually, like all the problems of free will, then all the problems involved in determinism. And you could argue, and people have been for hundreds of years, they've taken up one of those two positions, and they've virtually spent their whole time just debating that particular issue and trying to show how that was correct. Well, perhaps we're in an era now where we realise that we can turn them into paradoxes, but we can also see them as things we can modify to adapt to our situation. And there are aspects of determinism in free will, and there's aspects of free will in determinism. And I think that's what we were pointing out, that some of the flaws that I pointed out actually, were aspects of the internal in a view being presented as external, and some external that were being presented in terms of being internal. So, I think there's an absolute way of looking at it, each one, and you can argue for the next 2,000 years like they have the past 2,000 years, and you're trying to sort out either one or the other. It was an either or, and perhaps we now need to think of more how they can be both and.
Yes, to go off on that slight tangent, just a comment that, the free will versus determinism argument has no relevance, in my view, to humans. It's about God. It's omniscience versus omnipotence. And that's the argument. Omniscience versus omnipotence. Free will.
You have to
Anyway,
explain
go on,
that.
Conrad.
You have to explain that, David. I like that.
Yeah, well, okay, but this isn't today's topic. So, Stephen, go ahead.
What I did point out, and I think, Conrad, you're being a bit too general, is that we're dealing with, I did put provided the point that Nietzsche was a man of peculiar sensitivities. And it was for him, the idea of a mechanically determined universe was depressive. But at the same time, he couldn't disagree with it because this was the height of science at the time. How could science be wrong? Really? How can it be wrong? Science is the truth. And therefore, I have all these feelings about free will, and I've just found out that I'm a fool in a maze. You know, I'm nothing. I've been told all my life that God loves me, and then I realise God doesn't exist, and now I'm nothing. It was just Nietzsche, his peculiar sensitivities. Look, you know, most Germans didn't worry about stuff like that. Most Germans only worried about a stein of beer, a milkmaid to chase, and occasional singing songs about how great Germany was. And hey, Wagner's just, you know, created a national epic for us Germans, so we're all absolutely thrilled. So, you know, Nietzsche could have tried to get down with the other Germans and get drunk and chase the milkmaids. Or the whole thing was, he said, he avoided alcohol. Look what it did to Donald Trump. He avoided alcohol too. It's tragic. I mean, they could have been living, you know, a life of satisfying all their senses and stuff like this. But I'm just saying that Nietzsche's content, which we appreciate today, was a product of what he was. And the thing is to also remember that Nietzsche didn't come to his latter conclusions at the start of the process. At the start of the process, a lot of his stuff was just typical idealism and rationalism. It was later on he turned against idealism and rationalism. Some say he was pursuing a philosophy called Dynamism, which is a little bit like, you know, Taoism. It's the idea of where it's stuck between two opposing forces rather than the rationalist idea of everything can be created into or built into a perfect pyramid. The perfect tomb of humanity can be created for us by rationalism. And as she was saying, I'm tossing that out the window. I'm going with dynamism, that we're in a constant struggle between opposing forces. That's the nature of the will. But like I said, I didn't say that Nietzsche's perspective was one that everyone would come to. It was a man of peculiar sensitivity. This is a point Rudolf Steiner made. You know, Nietzsche was a man of the most peculiar, intense sensitivities for what he called truth. Nietzsche had the most intense sensitivity to truth, whatever that strange spook is, which is strange because Steiner actually points something out which I'm agreeing more and more with, that on a personal level, Nietzsche was a great liar. For example, he borrowed from Stirner without admitting it. You know, this is typical academic arrogance. Oh, that's a good idea. I think I'll rob this one without, you know, saying, oh, well, I got this idea from Stirner. No, he doesn't do that. And this is what, you know, Steiner's trying to point out. There's a little bit of dishonesty going on there. With Wagner, his attack on Wagner was already written. And finally, when the breakup came with Wagner, then he just pulled something out he had written years ago to attack Wagner with. And to Steiner, that was just an example of Nietzsche's dishonesty. But at the same time, Steiner would point out, Nietzsche had this intense sensitivity for truth, while at the same time being a liar. Isn't that a paradox? Thank you.
John?
I haven't read all the stuff that Stephen has read.
Okay, fair enough.
It's fair enough.
Les, your turn.
Thank you. Thanks, Conrad, for bringing up conditioning factors again. And when I was talking about being aware of the factors that condition your behavior, I wasn't saying that those factors, all factors that determine your behavior take away your free will. Actually, my view's the opposite. By being aware of the factors, the social, cultural, conditioning factors, by being aware of them, you actually enable your autonomy because you can reflect on them. This is the amazing thing about human beings. You can recognize, you can study, you can appreciate the factors in your environment, cultural environment, social environment, that sway you to marry this person or take this job. You can recognize it, reflect on it. And this is the good thing about the existentialists. They say, then you can make a more informed decision. That's what autonomy, that's what freedom is about. So to give you some examples, Sartre talks in one of his books, he talks about the waiter who's convinced themselves that they really want to be a waiter, but through further reflection, they realize, no, they've been conditioned into by social, by things around him, that he thought he wanted to be a waiter. But when he reflected, he realized, no, that's not true to myself. That's not true to my authentic self. So this is another capacity of human beings to rationalize, to think that what we're doing is really what we want to do, and we make up these, fabricate these reasons for why we think we want to do something. But when we reflect on it, we realize, no, they're just rationalizations. So that's Sartre's case of the waiter. Another case we see commonly in arranged marriages. People who go into an arranged marriage, adolescents, children, they convince themselves that this is really what they want. They really want to marry the person that their religion or their parents have organized for them. But when they think about it, some of them, when they think about it later, they think, no, I'm only doing this because I don't want to upset my parents. I don't want to go against my parents. I don't want to cause conflict. That's why I've convinced myself that I really want to marry this person. So there again, it's the reflection on what are these conditioning social factors that allow them to make an authentic decision. And the last case is a multitude of cases with people in my ex-religious support network who have been brought up in cults, high control religions that have dictated to them who they can have relations with, who they can marry, what kind of job they can take, what kind of God they worship. And they realize later that they have been brainwashed, and what they thought were free decisions that they were making were completely the opposite. So that's my third example of how people rationalize the decisions that they made, thinking they're rational. And this is a great thing about what I find great in existentialism. It's asking you to, hey, step back, look into the social and cultural conditioning factors, and then reflect on them and make up your own mind. So that's why I brought up these conditioning factors, Conrad, not as a way of taking away our free will, but actually enabling us to exercise our free will. Thanks.
David, I'd like that to be the conclusion. I've been going for 3.5 hours and I've got an 80-year-old brain, and that's about enough for one afternoon. And I just want to, when I get this opportunity, I always take it to especially thank David Miller for the
a tremendous amount of work and worry that he engages in making sure there are speakers and arranging the Zooms and all these stuff like that. We all appreciate it, certainly. I know you enjoy doing it, but we must make sure that every now and again we show our appreciation to what you're doing. So thanks very much.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you for the presentation, and thank you for being in the hot seat for.
Well, I found it to be a very warm seat, actually. I thought that, you know, things would get much more heated, but I'm absolutely amazed that it went so smoothly. And there have been some excellent contributions, and I've noted down a lot of things I want to give some more thought to. But if in general, the conflict between the two have been shown to be somehow resolvable, I've achieved my purpose, you know, that I've brought together, at least it's in some regards Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, but they're not really parts of a paradox. They're two figures that have made an interesting contribution, and they both have a share in, should be acknowledged, and that they certainly can come together with certain areas of agreement.
Yes, well, thank you for coping with all the questions and comments for 3 hours after your presentation, and thank everybody else for staying the distance. And so feel free to leave, John, and the discussion will just continue on.
Yeah, I'll get going. Thank you.
Okay, John, good.
Goodbye. Leave meeting.
Thanks, John.